Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The door to my bedroom stands open again this morning. I know because the hallway light cuts a sharp rectangle across my floor, illuminating dust particles that drift like tiny ghosts in the stale air. The door has been closed every night for the past 3 weeks. I make sure of it now. I check the latch twice, sometimes 3 times, running my fingers along the strike plate to confirm the bolt has caught. Yet every morning, without fail, I wake to find it gaping wide, as if inviting something in or letting something out. At first, I blamed the building's foundation. The apartment complex is old, built sometime in the 70s when construction standards were more suggestion than law. Settling foundations, uneven floors, warped door frames, all perfectly reasonable explanations for a door that won't stay shut. I even called maintenance, described the problem with the casual annoyance of someone reporting a leaky faucet. The superintendent came up on a Tuesday afternoon, a heavy-set man whose breath smelled of coffee and cigarettes. He examined the door for perhaps 40 seconds, jiggled the handle, declared everything looked fine, and left. The door opened again that night. I tried everything rational first, because that's what you do when confronted with a problem that has a logical solution. I adjusted the hinges with a screwdriver I found in a kitchen drawer. I wedged a towel against the bottom of the door. I even bought a rubber doorstop from the hardware store on Lexington, the kind with ridges designed to grip carpet fibers. None of it worked. Each morning brought the same sight: the door standing open, the hallway beyond dark and empty, the doorstop lying uselessly on its side several feet away as if kicked aside by an impatient foot. 3 weeks into this, I stopped sleeping well. The human mind is remarkably adaptable to routine, even unsettling routine. You can grow accustomed to almost anything if it happens often enough. But adaptation doesn't mean acceptance, and acceptance doesn't mean peace. Every night as I settled into bed, I found myself staring at that closed door, waiting for the inevitable. The apartment would be silent except for the ambient noise of city life filtering through the walls. Distant sirens, the occasional shout from the street below, the rumble of the subway running beneath the building's foundation. Normal sounds, comforting sounds, the sounds of a living city that never truly sleeps. But inside my apartment, the silence grew heavier as the night deepened. I began waking earlier and earlier, consciousness pulling me from sleep like a fisherman reeling in a catch. First it was 5 in the morning, then 4:30, then 4. My body seemed determined to witness something, though my mind couldn't articulate what. The door was always open by the time I woke, but I never caught the moment of opening, never heard the click of the latch releasing or the whisper of wood sliding across carpet. Until the night I woke at 3. The sound that pulled me from sleep wasn't loud. It was barely a sound at all, more like a change in air pressure, the sensation of space shifting around you. My eyes opened in the darkness, and for a moment I lay perfectly still, disoriented and confused about what had woken me. The room felt different somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint how. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more profound. Even the usual city sounds had faded to nothing, as if the world beyond my walls had simply ceased to exist. Then I heard it, the soft, distinctive click of the door latch releasing. My heart, which had been beating its normal resting rhythm, suddenly hammered against my ribs. I didn't move, couldn't move. I watched from my bed as the door began to swing slowly inward, moving with the careful deliberation of something being pushed rather than pulled by gravity. The rectangle of hallway light appeared, growing wider as the door opened, revealing the space beyond my room inch by excruciating inch. The hallway should have been empty. I live alone. There's no one else here. But as the door reached its full extension, something moved in the corridor beyond. It wasn't a clear shape, not a person exactly, or at least not a person I could describe with any accuracy. It was more like a disruption in the darkness, a place where the shadows seemed to gather and consolidate into something almost substantial. It moved from left to right across my field of vision, passing the open doorway with an unhurried pace that suggested routine, as if this was something it did every night, as if I was the intruder in this ritual, not the other way around. I didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't dare move even the smallest muscle for fear that any motion would draw its attention toward my bed. The figure, if it was a figure, continued past the doorway and disappeared down the hall toward the living room. I heard nothing. No footsteps, no rustle of clothing, no breathing. Just that same sense of air displacement, of space being occupied by something that shouldn't be there. When I finally convinced my paralyzed lungs to draw breath, it came in a sharp, shaking gasp that sounded impossibly loud in the stillness. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty doorway, waiting for the figure to return. It never did. Eventually, as gray dawn light began seeping around the edges of my curtains, I worked up the courage to get out of bed and check the apartment. Every room was empty, every door and window locked from the inside. No sign of intrusion, no evidence that anyone had been there except me. I called in sick to work that day. The rational part of my mind tried desperately to construct an explanation. A hallucination brought on by sleep paralysis, perhaps, or a waking dream caused by stress and disrupted sleep patterns. I'd been working long hours at the firm, billing 80-hour weeks that left me exhausted and strung out on coffee and takeout food. Maybe my brain was simply misfiring, creating phantom shapes out of shadows and exhaustion. But I knew what I'd seen, or at least, I knew I'd seen something. That night, I tried to stay awake. I sat up in bed with my back against the headboard, a cup of coffee growing cold on the nightstand beside me, determined to witness the door opening again. I would catch it in the act this time, would confirm whether it was mechanical failure or something else entirely. But consciousness is a slippery thing when you're running on too little sleep and too much anxiety. Despite my best efforts, my eyelids grew heavy somewhere around 2:30. My head nodded forward, then jerked back up. Forward again, back up. The room swam in and out of focus. When I opened my eyes next, the door stood wide open and my phone's clock read 3:01 a.m. The figure was already passing through the hallway. This time I was more alert, less paralyzed by shock. I forced myself to focus on it, to extract details that might explain what I was seeing. The shape moved with a strange gliding quality, as if its feet, if it had feet, never quite touched the floor. It was roughly human in proportion but oddly two-dimensional, like a silhouette cut from black paper and somehow given the ability to move through three-dimensional space. Where it passed, the darkness seemed to thicken, becoming almost textured. I don't know what possessed me to do what I did next. Fear should have kept me frozen, should have convinced me to stay in my bed where at least the illusion of safety existed. But something else overrode the fear. Anger, maybe, or desperation, or simply the human need to understand. Before I could talk myself out of it, I threw off my covers and stood. The figure didn't react to my movement. It continued down the hallway at the same measured pace, apparently unaware or unconcerned with my presence. I followed at a distance, my bare feet silent on the carpet, my breath coming in short, controlled gasps. The thing turned left at the end of the hall, moving toward the living room, and I crept after it, keeping close to the wall. When I reached the corner and peered around, the living room appeared empty, but the front door of my apartment stood slightly ajar, as if something had just passed through it. The chain lock hung loose, and I knew, absolutely knew, that I'd secured it before going to bed. I'd checked it twice, the way I now checked everything twice, 3 times, 4 times. I approached the door slowly, my heart beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. Through the gap, I could see a sliver of the hallway beyond, the corridor that connected all the apartments on my floor. The building's fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting their sterile glow across beige walls and brown carpet. Everything looked normal, empty, safe. I pulled the door open wider and stepped into the hallway. The corridor stretched in both directions, lined with identical doors leading to identical apartments. The elevator bank sat at one end, the stairwell access at the other. Nothing moved. No shadows glided along the walls. No figures stood waiting. Just an ordinary hallway in an ordinary building at an extraordinary hour when most sane people were asleep. Then I noticed the apartment door directly across from mine stood open several inches, just like my own door. And beyond it, in the darkness of someone else's apartment, I thought I saw movement. A shift in the shadows. The suggestion of a shape. I don't remember walking back into my apartment. Don't remember closing and locking the door. My next clear memory is sitting on my couch with all the lights on, watching the sky slowly brighten through my windows as the city woke around me. At some point I must have called my boss and taken another sick day. I certainly didn't go to work. The next few nights established a pattern that I couldn't break no matter what I tried. 3 a.m. would arrive with the precision of a train schedule, and the door would open. Sometimes I saw the figure, sometimes I didn't. But I always heard that click, that whisper of air displacement, and I always woke to find the door standing wide and the hallway beyond dark and waiting. I started sleeping with the lights on, then with the television playing. Then I stopped sleeping in the bedroom altogether, dragging my blankets to the couch where I could at least face the front door and see if something tried to enter. None of it helped. The bedroom door still opened at 3, and when I worked up the courage to check, the apartment across the hall still stood slightly ajar, revealing darkness within. I considered moving, but where would I go? And what if the problem wasn't the apartment? What if it was me? That thought began worming its way into my consciousness during the long, sleepless hours between 3 a.m. and dawn. What if I was somehow causing this? What if my mind had broken in some fundamental way, and these nighttime rituals were nothing more than elaborate hallucinations? I'd read about people experiencing psychotic breaks, their grip on reality slowly slipping until they couldn't distinguish between what was real and what existed only in their fractured perception. But hallucinations don't leave doors open, don't leave doorstops kicked across the room, don't affect other apartments. Unless I was the one opening the doors. Unless I was sleepwalking, performing these actions in some fugue state I couldn't remember. Unless I was the figure in the hallway, and the real horror was that I'd become the very thing I feared. I installed a camera, a small motion-activated thing I bought from an electronics store, and mounted on my dresser, angled to capture both the bedroom door and a slice of the hallway beyond. If something was happening, if something was really coming into my apartment every night, the camera would capture it. And if nothing appeared on the footage, well, then I'd know the problem was internal rather than external. Either way, I'd have an answer. That night, I lay in bed staring at the red recording light, waiting for 3 a.m. with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. When the appointed hour arrived and the door clicked open, I watched it swing inward with the same careful deliberation, revealing the now familiar sight of the darkened hallway. The figure passed by, that shadow thing that was and wasn't, moving with its strange gliding motion toward the living room and beyond. In the morning, I reviewed the footage with shaking hands. The camera had recorded perfectly. I could see myself lying in bed, see the door standing closed, see the room in grainy night vision. Then, at exactly 3 a.m., the video went dark. Not black like someone had covered the lens, but distorted, as if the camera couldn't process what it was seeing. The image broke apart into digital artifacts, squares of corrupted data, frozen frames, streaks of color that shouldn't exist in night vision. The audio track hissed and popped with interference. This lasted for perhaps 30 seconds. Then the image stabilized, showing the door standing wide open, and me lying motionless in bed, staring toward the hallway with wide, terrified eyes. I watched this recording a dozen times, then a dozen more. Each viewing revealed nothing new, just that 30-second window of impossible static, during which something had happened that the camera couldn't capture or process. The timestamp never jumped or stuttered. Time continued its forward march, even if the recording couldn't document what occurred within it. I deleted the footage. I don't know why. Some instinct told me that keeping it would be a mistake, that having evidence of something so profoundly wrong would only make things worse. Then I packed a bag and left the apartment, checking into a hotel room on the other side of the city, where maybe, just maybe, I could sleep through the night without interruption. The hotel room was on the 14th floor, high enough that I felt safely removed from whatever was happening in my apartment. I kept the lights on anyway, positioned myself in bed where I could see the door, and waited for sleep to come. It didn't. I lay awake watching the clock on the nightstand, watching the numbers advance toward 3 with the slow inevitability of a funeral march. 2:58, 2:59, 3:00. The hotel room door didn't open. Nothing moved in the hallway beyond. The silence remained unbroken except for the hum of the air conditioning and the muffled sounds of the city far below. I felt my body relax incrementally, tension bleeding out of muscles that had been clenched for weeks. Maybe it really was the apartment. Maybe I'd left the problem behind along with all my other possessions. Then I heard it. A soft click from across the room. The bathroom door, which I'd left closed, stood open. The darkness within seemed deeper than it should be, textured and shifting. And as I watched with a scream building in my throat, something moved in that darkness. Something that had followed me here, or had always been with me, or had never existed anywhere except in the deteriorating corridors of my own mind. I checked out of the hotel at dawn and drove back to my apartment as the city woke around me. The early morning commuters crowded the sidewalks, clutching coffee cups and staring at phones, living their normal lives in their normal world. I envied them. I hated them. I wanted to be them again, to remember what it felt like when doors stayed closed and 3 a.m. was just another hour that passed unnoticed while you slept. My apartment waited for me exactly as I'd left it. The bedroom door stood open, of course. It always did in the morning. I walked through each room, checking corners and closets, confirming I was alone. Then I sat on my couch and tried to think. The rational explanations had all failed. The irrational ones terrified me. I was caught between two equally horrifying possibilities. Either something impossible was happening, or I was losing my mind. I didn't know which option was worse. As I sit here now, writing this, the sun is setting beyond my windows. The shadows are lengthening across my floor. In a few hours, it will be time. 3 a.m. will arrive, as it always does, and the door will open. The figure will pass by, performing its nightly ritual, and I will lie in my bed, watching, wondering if any of this is real. The truth is, I'm afraid to find out. I'm afraid that if I ever truly understand what's happening, the knowledge will break something fundamental inside me. Maybe ignorance isn't bliss, but it might be the only thing keeping me tethered to whatever sanity I have left. Tonight I'll go to bed like I always do. I'll close the door and check the latch twice. I'll lie down and pull the covers up to my chin. And at 3 a.m., when that familiar click echoes through the silence, I'll open my eyes and watch it happen all over again. Because what else can I do? Where else can I go? The thing in the hallway, real or imagined, external or internal, has become part of my existence now, as routine and inevitable as breathing. I've stopped fighting it. I've stopped trying to understand it. I've just started wondering, what happens if one night, instead of passing by, it stops at my doorway and turns to look at me? What happens if this ritual that's been playing out for weeks is just a prelude to something worse? And the question that keeps me awake long after 3 a.m. has come and gone. If I'm imagining all of this, if it's all happening only in my head, why do I feel like I'm being watched even now? Even as I write these words in the full light of day? The door will open tonight. It always does. I've accepted that. What I haven't accepted is the possibility that one night, it might close with me on the wrong side of it. Story 2. The cabin in Vermont wasn't supposed to be memorable. That was the whole point. I'd rented it for 2 weeks in late October, far enough from the main road that cell service flickered in and out like a dying bulb, close enough to civilization that I could convince myself I wasn't running away, just taking a break. A reset. The kind of thing people do when they've spent 3 months photographing war refugees and need to remember what silence sounds like. The first week passed in that pleasant blur of solitude. Coffee at dawn, long walks through skeletal birch groves, Evenings spent at my laptop organizing thousands of images into folders with clinical names. By the second week, I'd fallen into a rhythm that felt almost meditative. Sleep when tired, eat when hungry, work when the light was right. The cabin's isolation had become a kind of drug, and I was mainlining it. The night it happened, I'd been awake since 6 the previous evening, riding a wave of productivity that photographers know well. That manic focus where hours dissolve and your eyes start to burn but stopping feels impossible. My back ached from hunching over the desk. Empty coffee mugs formed a small ceramic village around my laptop. Outside, the October darkness pressed against the windows like something solid, something with weight. It was 4:20 a.m. when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was the cabin settling, old wood contracting in the cold. But then I recognized the distinct clink of glass against glass. A toast, maybe. Then another sound threaded through. Laughter, muffled but unmistakable. The kind of laughter that comes from deep in the chest, genuine and unguarded. Then more sounds layered in. Silverware scraping against plates, chairs sliding across floorboards. The low murmur of conversation just below the threshold of comprehension. I sat frozen at my desk, one hand still on my mouse, cursor hovering over a photo of a 10-year-old's hands holding an empty bowl. The sounds were coming from the hallway. No, not from it, through it. Like someone had left a radio on in another room, volume turned low but persistent. I pulled my headphones off, letting them dangle around my neck. The sounds continued, now clearer without the buffer. There was definitely silverware. Definitely voices. A party, my brain supplied helpfully, though that made no sense. The nearest cabin was half a mile through thick woods. The road was unpaved and treacherous at night. No one was having a party anywhere near here. I stood slowly, joints popping from hours of stillness. The wooden floor was cold through my wool socks. I'd left my boots by the door, brown leather Timberlands caked with mud from yesterday's walk. I slid my feet into them without bothering to tie the laces, eyes fixed on the hallway that stretched between my bedroom-turned-office and the cabin's front entrance. The sounds grew louder, not dramatically. Not like in movies where everything suddenly swells to a crescendo. This was gradual, incremental, like someone slowly turning a volume knob clockwise. Another toast, more laughter, the scrape of a chair, a voice saying something that might have been a joke, followed by a ripple of response that I could almost understand. I took a step toward the doorway. The sounds increased, just slightly. Another step, louder still, as if I was approaching the source, except there was nothing to approach. The hallway was empty. I could see it from where I stood. Plain wooden walls painted a forgettable beige, a narrow strip of braided rug running down the center. The front door at the far end with its small window revealing nothing but darkness beyond. 3 more steps, and I was in the hallway itself. The floorboards vibrated under my boots, not violently, but with a subtle thrumming that traveled up through the rubber soles and into my bones. Like standing on a subway platform as a train approaches. That same sense of imminent arrival. The sounds were now clearly coming from ahead of me, from the direction of the front door, though that made even less sense than them coming from the hallway. I thought about the physics of sound, how it travels, how it can be distorted by wind or temperature or architecture. I thought about echo chambers and acoustic tricks. I thought about anything except what my gut was trying to tell me. Halfway down the hall, I stopped. The party sounds, because that's what they were, unmistakably now, a full dinner party in progress, had reached a volume that should have had a source, should have had people, should have had light and warmth and actual human beings sitting around a table. Instead, there was just the empty hallway, the vibrating floor, and a growing pressure in my chest that felt like recognition, though I didn't know what I was recognizing. I took another step. The voices sharpened. I could almost make out words now. Someone was telling a story. Someone else was laughing. Glasses were being refilled. The convivial chaos of a gathering in full swing. Another step. The vibration intensified. My teeth were starting to chatter, though the cabin wasn't cold. I'd kept the heat running at a steady 70 degrees. Another step. Now I could hear the creak of chairs as people shifted their weight, the soft thud of a bottle being set down on wood, that particular rustle of fabric that means someone is leaning forward, engaged, eager to hear what comes next. I was 10 feet from the door. The sounds were now as loud as if I was standing in the room where they originated. No, louder. As if I was inside the sound itself, submerged in it. The pressure in my chest had grown to something approaching pain. My heart was doing strange things, skipping beats and then doubling up to compensate. 5 feet from the door. I could see my breath now, though the thermostat still read 70. Little clouds of condensation forming and dissolving in the air before me. The door's window showed nothing. Just darkness. Just October night in rural Vermont. Just the ordinary absence of light. 3 feet. A new sound emerged from the cacophony. Music. Something classical, strings and piano, the kind of sophisticated background music that people play at dinner parties when they want to seem cultured without actually being distracting. It wove through the conversation, under it and over it, sometimes swelling, sometimes fading, but always present. 2 feet. My hand was reaching for the doorknob without my conscious permission. The brass was tarnished, needed polishing. I'd noticed that on my first day, thought about mentioning it to the rental company, then forgot. Now it was all I could see. That dull brass knob, spotted with age and use, waiting. 1 foot. Every cell in my body was screaming at me to turn around. That animal part of the brain that's kept humans alive for millennia was ringing alarm bells so loud they drowned out thought. But I kept moving forward, drawn by something I couldn't name. Curiosity, maybe, or compulsion, or that particular form of human stupidity that makes us investigate strange sounds in the dark instead of running. My fingers touched the knob. The sounds reached a peak, laughter and music and the clink of cutlery all blending into a symphony of invisible celebration. I started to turn the knob. Something pushed me, not from behind, from ahead, through the door. A force that hit my chest like a palm strike, flat and firm and undeniable. I stumbled backward, arms windmilling, boots catching on the edge of the rug. I went down hard, tailbone slamming into the floorboards with a pain that shot up my spine and exploded in my skull. The sound stopped. Not fading, not gradually diminishing. Just stopping, as if someone had jerked a needle off a record mid-song. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was so complete it felt solid, oppressive. I could hear my own breathing, harsh and rapid. Could hear my heart hammering against my ribs. Could hear the cabin creaking as it settled, those ordinary sounds now sinister in the wake of what had just happened. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, trying to process. Had I tripped? Had I imagined the push? The sounds themselves? Had they been real? Maybe I'd been working too long, sleep-deprived brain-generating auditory hallucinations. Carbon monoxide poisoning? A gas leak? I pulled myself up, every muscle trembling. The hallway looked exactly as it always had. Empty. Ordinary. The front door was closed, locked, the brass knob gleaming dully in the light from my office. Nothing was out of place. Nothing had changed. Except me. I scrambled back to the office on shaking legs and started pulling furniture. The desk first, shoving my laptop aside without bothering to save my work, dragging the heavy wooden piece toward the doorway. It left gouges in the floor. I didn't care. Next was the chair, then the small bookcase, then anything else I could lift. I piled it all in the doorway, creating a barricade that was more psychological than practical, as if a few pieces of furniture could keep out whatever had just pushed me. As I worked, my camera caught my eye. It was sitting where I'd left it next to the laptop, lens cap off. The small LCD screen on the back was lit up, showing thumbnails of recent photos. I hadn't touched it since yesterday afternoon. I picked it up with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The thumbnails were all from tonight, from the last few hours. Dozens of them, taken at regular intervals. But I hadn't taken any photos tonight. I'd been working on my laptop, organizing old images. I hadn't even looked at the camera. I clicked through to view them full size. The first image showed the hallway, taken from my position at the desk. Empty, ordinary, timestamp 4:22 a.m. The second showed the hallway again, but now there was something in the frame. A wine glass suspended in midair at about chest height, right where the hallway met the entrance to the office. No hand holding it, no table beneath it, just a glass of red wine hanging in space. Timestamp 4:24 a.m. The third image, 2 glasses now, both floating, both full. Timestamp 4:26 a.m. I clicked faster, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the camera. More glasses, a plate, hovering. Silverware arranged in the air as if on an invisible table. Another plate, another setting, and another, all suspended at precise heights, forming a table setting for 6, 8, 10 people. Except there was no table, no people, just objects hanging in empty space. The last photo showed the hallway full of them. A complete dinner party, frozen in mid-air. Dozens of glasses, all at different heights as if people were mid-toast. Plates with food on them. I could see something that looked like roasted meat, vegetables, bread, all perfectly arranged on nothing. Silverware caught mid-gesture, as if invisible hands had been lifting forks to invisible mouths. Even napkins, crumpled and draped over invisible laps. Timestamp 4:32 a.m. That was 8 minutes ago. I set the camera down slowly, carefully, as if sudden movement might trigger something. The office felt too small suddenly, the walls too close. I could feel the weight of the barricade I'd built, all that furniture pressed into the doorway, keeping something out, or keeping me in. The question that I couldn't shake, that wormed its way into my brain and refused to leave, was simple and terrible. Had the camera caught something real that I couldn't see? Or had something else used the camera, creating images of a feast I'd never witnessed? A celebration I'd only heard? I looked at the viewfinder again, at those dozens of suspended glasses, and realized with a creeping coldness that I recognized one of them. The wine glass in the foreground, nearest to where I sat. I'd photographed it before, 6 years ago, in a different country, at a different table. It had belonged to a woman who died 3 days after I took her picture, killed in a bombing that destroyed her home, her family, her entire neighborhood. I'd captured her mid-laugh, mid-toast, that exact glass raised to celebrate her daughter's engagement. The glass that was now floating in my hallway. I started going through the other photos more carefully, zooming in on details. The plate with the roasted meat, I'd seen that pattern before. A village in Syria. The silverware, wrong, that couldn't be right, but yes, there it was. The bent fork I'd documented in a refugee camp in Greece, and that napkin with the embroidered edge. My phone buzzed, making me jump so violently I knocked over one of the empty coffee mugs. It clattered across the desk, rolling, and I caught it before it fell. The notification was from my cloud storage. Backup complete. 12,000 new photos uploaded. 12,000. I'd taken maybe 30 photos yesterday. I'd taken nothing today. Tonight. My cursor hovered over the notification, finger trembling above the trackpad. Part of me knew I shouldn't look. That same animal instinct that had screamed at me to run from the door was now howling at me to delete the backup, throw the camera out the window, get in my car, and drive until Vermont was a memory. But I clicked. The new folder opened, filling my screen with thumbnails, row after row after row of images. All taken tonight according to the timestamps. All showing the same thing, with slight variations. The hallway, the floating objects, the invisible feast. But as I scrolled, the images changed. The floating objects were no longer alone. There were shadows now, faint but present, humanoid shapes forming around the suspended place settings. Not distinct enough to be called figures, not vague enough to be ignored. Suggestions of presence, implications of form. I kept scrolling, even though everything in me wanted to stop. The shadows grew more defined. Shoulders, heads. The suggestion of hands reaching for glasses. The hint of faces turning toward the camera, toward me. The last image in the folder wasn't taken from my position at the desk. The angle was wrong. It was taken from the hallway looking back into the office, showing me hunched over my laptop, unaware. And in the doorway behind me, pressed against the barricade I'd built, were dozens of shadow figures, crowding together, reaching toward my oblivious back with hands that weren't quite hands. The timestamp on that photo was 4:47 a.m. I checked my watch. 4:48 a.m. A sound behind me, soft, barely audible. The gentle clink of glass against glass. A toast. I don't know if I'll ever leave this office. The barricade feels both essential and pointless. The camera's screen keeps lighting up with new images that I refuse to look at, thumbnails multiplying in the corner of my vision. My laptop battery is at 15%. The coffee is long cold. The October darkness outside has started to pale at the edges, though sunrise feels like a promise someone else made. And I can't shake the thought that keeps circling through my exhausted mind. Every person in those photos I took over the years, every face I captured and cataloged and filed away, I'd ask them all to smile, to look at me, to be seen. What if they accepted the invitation? What if they're still trying to be seen? The floorboards are vibrating again, softly, gently, like a subway train approaching, like guests arriving for a party that never ends. And I'm so very tired of being alone. Story 3. The coffee always tasted like ash after 3 in the morning. I discovered this on a Tuesday, sitting in the back corner of Desert Bloom Coffee, with my spine pressed against brick that still held the day's heat. The AC had been broken for a week, and the air inside felt thick enough to chew. Outside, Tempe sprawled dark and empty, except for the occasional car drifting past on Mill Avenue, like a ghost looking for somewhere to haunt. The new barista had started Monday. I noticed because I'd been coming to Desert Bloom every morning for 2 years, and faces behind the counter changed about as often as the Arizona sky changed seasons. This one was young, maybe early 20s, with the kind of forgettable features that made you work to remember them even while you were still looking. Brown hair, medium height, a name tag that said employee, because they probably hadn't made him a real one yet. He'd made my usual without asking. Americano, extra shot, no room, which I'd chalked up to good training or lucky guessing. But then he'd slid it across the counter and said, "There you go, birdie." My hand froze halfway to the cup. Nobody called me that. Nobody except my brother. And he'd been gone for 8 months, buried in a cemetery 3 states away where the grass grew thick and obscene over the dry earth that held his bones. Birdie, a stupid nickname from when we were kids. Something about how I'd flapped my arms while learning to shoot hoops, like a bird trying to figure out flight. He'd called me that until the day they'd put the breathing tube in his throat, until the scar tissue had twisted his voice into something that couldn't quite form the right sounds anymore. I must have stared, because the barista had laughed, a soft, uncertain sound. "Sorry, man. Did I get it wrong? I thought that's what you went by." "How did you—" My voice came out strange, compressed. "Where did you hear that?" He'd shrugged, already turning to wipe down the espresso machine. "Must have picked it up somewhere. We get a lot of regulars." I'd taken my coffee and left without another word, my pulse doing something arrhythmic in my chest. That night, I'd lain awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling fan making its endless rotations and trying to logic my way through it. He'd overheard someone. He'd seen my name somewhere and made a weird lucky guess. He'd confused me with someone else. But none of those explanations sat right, like trying to force the wrong piece into a puzzle just because you wanted the picture complete. Wednesday morning, I almost didn't go. I stood in my kitchen watching light creep across the countertop, thinking about the chain coffee place 3 blocks further away, the one that was reliably mediocre and anonymous. But routine is a powerful thing, especially when you've built your life on the scaffolding of small, repeated actions to keep from thinking too hard about what's been lost. The barista smiled when I walked in, that same forgettable face somehow more familiar than it should be after just 1 day. "Americano, extra shot, right?" I nodded, watching him work, studying the way his hands moved across the machine with a practiced efficiency that seemed at odds with being brand new. When he brought the cup over, I kept my fingers wrapped around the ceramic to stop them from shaking. "Hey, quick question," I said, aiming for casual and landing somewhere in the vicinity of tense. "Yesterday, when you called me, that name, where did you hear it?" He paused, and something flickered across his face too quickly to identify. "You know, I've been trying to remember. I think maybe one of the night customers mentioned you. We get different people coming through late, after the bars close. Sometimes they chat about the day regulars." He laughed, a little apologetically. "I know it's weird. I probably shouldn't use nicknames with people I just met." "What night customer?" "Oh, I don't work nights, I just hear stories, you know. From Devin. He does the closing shift." Another shrug, dismissive, already moving on. "Guy's got stories about everyone who comes through here." I wanted to press, but a line was forming behind me, and the moment was dissolving like sugar in hot water. I took my coffee to my usual table by the window and tried to focus on work, but the laptop screen just reflected my face back at me, pale and wrong in the morning light. Devin. I knew Devin, at least by sight. Older guy, 50s maybe, with gray in his beard and a collection of vintage band t-shirts he rotated through. We'd exchanged nods and weather commentary, but never anything you'd call a conversation. Certainly nothing that would have given him access to a name that existed in exactly two places: my brother's mouth and the locked rooms of my memory. Thursday, I came in late afternoon, close to shift change. Devin was there, restocking the pastry case with the same tired croissants they'd had since Tuesday. I waited until the after-work rush cleared out, then approached the counter with my heart doing something uncomfortable behind my ribs. "Hey, Devin, right? Hey, Devin." He glanced up, friendly enough. "That's me. What can I get you?" "Actually, I wanted to ask about something. The new guy said you mentioned me to him? Told him about a nickname?" His brow furrowed, genuine confusion settling into the lines around his eyes. "The new guy? We haven't hired anyone new in 3 months." The floor seemed to tilt slightly, and I gripped the counter. The barista who's been working mornings this week. Brown hair, early 20s, name tag says. "Employee?" Devin's laugh was short and puzzled. "Man, we've got 6 people who work mornings, and I know all of them. Nobody new." "Maybe you're thinking of the Mill Avenue location?" I described him in detail. The height, the haircut, the way he moved behind the counter, and watched Devin's confusion deepen into something that looked almost like concern. "I honestly don't know who you're describing," he said finally. "And I definitely never talked to anyone about your nickname or whatever. How would I even know your nickname?" How would anyone, I thought, but didn't say. I mumbled something about mixing things up and left my coffee order unmade, walking out into the blast furnace afternoon feeling like my skin had been turned inside out. That night, I sat in my apartment and searched through my phone for any social media mention of the name. Nothing. I called my mother, asked if she'd told anyone, then immediately regretted it when I heard her voice catch in that way it did now whenever we talked about him. "No," she said. "That was just between you boys. I should have stayed away from Desert Bloom. Any reasonable person would have. But there's something about having your reality questioned that makes you want to grab hold of it with both hands, to press your fingers into the bruise just to confirm it hurts." Friday morning, I arrived early, when the sky was still that particular shade of purple-gray that precedes dawn. Only one barista was working, a woman named Kelly I'd known for months. She made my drink and asked about my weekend plans, and everything was blessedly perfectly normal until I was halfway out the door and heard her call after me. "Oh, hey. Almost forgot. Some guy left this for you last night." She held up a cup sleeve with writing on it in black marker. "Birdie, you always did shoot hook shots like a wounded bird. Remember that time I told you it was because of your neck? -M." The cup sleeve fell from Kelly's hand, and I realized I'd made a sound, something between a gasp and a choke. My brother's name was Mitchell. Everyone called him Mitch. I called him M when I was mad at him, dragging out the single letter like an insult and a term of endearment wrapped together. The neck thing. Jesus Christ, the neck thing. When we were teenagers, before the accident that would later become the long deterioration that would later become the funeral, I still couldn't quite believe I'd attended. My brother had been relentless about my hook shot. You throw like you've got a broken neck, Bertie, like someone's got your head on sideways. It had been his favorite joke, the way siblings find one specific thing and worry at it until it becomes part of the family mythology. 5 years after those jokes, a drunk driver would hit his car from the side, and the seatbelt would do something terrible to his throat. The surgeries that followed left him with a scar from ear to collarbone, and a voice that never quite worked right again. We never talked about the hook shot after that. The irony felt too cruel, too pointed. "Are you okay?" Kelly's voice came from somewhere far away. "You look like you're going to pass out." I wasn't okay. I took the cup sleeve with hands that didn't feel attached to my body and walked out into the parking lot where the morning heat was already building towards something intolerable. In my car, I read the message 17 times, looking for a way it could be anything other than what it was. Someone was fucking with me. That was the only explanation. Some elaborate sick joke. But who? And how? The details were too specific, too buried in the substrata of brotherly interaction that had never made it onto social media or into stories told at gatherings. They existed in the space between just the two of us, in the architecture of a relationship that had been dismantled when his heart stopped beating in a hospital room while I held his hand and felt the world reconfigure itself around his absence. I didn't go back to Desert Bloom that weekend. I stayed in my apartment with the blinds drawn, jumping at every sound, checking and rechecking the locks on my door. Sunday night, I finally worked up the courage to do what I'd been avoiding. I searched for Desert Bloom's hours and confirmed they closed at 10 p.m. No night shift, no customers coming through after the bars closed. Monday, I resolved to talk to the owner, demand to see security footage, get answers. But when I arrived at the coffee shop, the morning felt stretched thin, reality too translucent. The same barista, the one who couldn't possibly work there, smiled at me from behind the counter. "Hey, Bertie. Americano?" I must have nodded because he started making it, humming something under his breath that tickled at the edges of familiarity. When he handed me the cup, our fingers brushed, and his skin felt fever hot. "You know," he said conversationally, "that customer I mentioned? M. He came by again last night. Wanted me to tell you something." My throat closed. "This place doesn't have a night shift." "Sure it does." His smile never wavered. "How else would M come by? M is dead." The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, the coffee shop seemed to hold its breath, the espresso machine silent, the other customers frozen in their morning routines, even the traffic outside gone still. Then the barista leaned across the counter, and I saw that his eyes were my brother's eyes, the exact shade of hazel green that I'd watched cloud over in a hospital bed 8 months ago. "Is he?" the barista asked softly. "Or are you?" I stumbled backward, knocking into a table, sending someone's laptop clattering. When I looked up again, the barista's eyes were brown, forgettable, and he was asking if I was all right with what sounded like genuine concern. I ran, actually ran, like a child fleeing nightmares, out into the parking lot where the sun was too bright and the heat too solid and everything too emphatically real. In my car, I sat shaking, trying to remember how to breathe, trying to remember which memories I could trust. That night, Monday night, after the day when reality had cracked just wide enough to let something impossible through, I knew what I had to do. I had to see the night shift for myself, had to confirm that it didn't exist, or that it did, or that I was losing my mind in quantifiable ways that could be measured and medicated. I arrived at Desert Bloom at 11 p.m., 2 hours before closing time according to the schedule posted on the door. The place was locked, dark except for a security light in the back. The sign said they closed at 10. Of course they did. There was no night shift. There never had been. I sat in my car in the parking lot, watching the empty building, feeling foolish and desperate and increasingly unmoored from whatever certainty I'd been clinging to. Midnight came and went. 1 a.m. too, At 3:11 a.m., and I knew the time exactly because I'd been checking my phone obsessively, like I could anchor myself to reality through the steady march of minutes. Lights flickered on inside Desert Bloom. I thought I was hallucinating. Had to be. But the lights stayed on, warm and yellow through the windows, and I could see movement inside. A figure behind the counter. My hand reached for the door handle before my brain could override the impulse. I crossed the parking lot on legs that felt boneless, pushed open the door that should have been locked, and stepped into Desert Bloom at 3 in the morning. The place was exactly as it was during the day. Same tables, same pastry case, same chalkboard menu. Except everything was slightly off, like looking at a photograph that's been imperceptibly altered. The colors seemed more saturated. The shadows fell at wrong angles. The hum of the refrigerator was pitched just low enough to sound like words if you listened too closely. Behind the counter stood the barista, the impossible one. He looked up when I entered, unsurprised. "Knew you'd come," he said. I wanted to run. Instead, I walked forward, drawn by the same terrible curiosity that makes you pick at scabs, that makes you look at accident scenes, that makes you attend funerals for people whose absence you can't quite process. "What are you?" My voice came out steadier than I'd expected. "What do you think I am?" "I think I'm having a breakdown. I think grief does things to the mind that look a lot like what's happening." He nodded slowly, like I'd said something profound. "That's possible. Very possible. Or..." He gestured around the empty coffee shop, at the wrong-angled shadows and the too bright lights. "Or something else is happening. M is dead. You keep saying that, because it's true. I was there. I held his hand while he died." "Did you?" The barista, M, my brother, some impossible amalgamation of the two, tilted his head. "Or did you hold someone's hand while they left? Those aren't always the same thing." Behind me, something made a sound. I turned to see the receipt printer churning out paper, though no one had touched the register. The barista walked over and tore off the printed slip, held it out to me. I didn't want to take it. Taking it meant engaging with this, meant accepting that at 3 in the morning in a coffee shop that shouldn't be open, something was trying to communicate through thermal paper and impossible knowledge. I took it. The receipt read, "For him. M." "He asks about you," the barista said quietly. "Every night. Wants to make sure you're okay. Wants to know if you're still shooting those ugly hook shots if you fixed your form." "Stop." The word came out broken. "Please stop. He knows you think about the accident. About how if you'd called him that night, just 5 minutes earlier, he might have left the bar sooner, might have missed the drunk driver by seconds. He knows you've been carrying that." I hadn't told anyone that. Not my mother, not the therapist I'd seen twice before deciding that talking about feelings was worse than just burying them. It was the thought that woke me at 2 a.m. most nights, the mental loop I couldn't escape. If I'd called, if I'd texted, if I'd reached out just a few minutes earlier. "He wants you to know," the barista continued, and his voice was changing now, becoming more familiar, taking on the raspy quality my brothers had after the surgeries, "that you couldn't have known. That it wasn't your fault. That he doesn't blame you for the things you didn't do or the time you didn't have." I was crying. When had I started crying? The tears felt hot and foreign on my face. "This isn't real," I said, but I didn't sound convinced even to myself. "Does that matter?" "Yes, number. I don't know." I sank into one of the chairs, letting the receipt flutter to the table. "I don't know what's real anymore." The barista sat across from me, and in the strange light of the impossible night shift, I could see traces of my brother in his features. The way his mouth quirked at the corner, the specific angle of his jaw. Or maybe I was just so desperate to see him again that I'd conjure him from anything, from anyone. "He wanted me to tell you one more thing," the barista said. "He said the hook shot was never really that bad. He just liked giving you shit about it because that's what brothers do. Said you were always better at basketball than you thought you were. Better at a lot of things." Something in my chest cracked open. and the grief I'd been holding at arm's length for 8 months rushed in like floodwater. I put my head in my hands and sobbed. Actually sobbed. The kind of crying that empties you out and leaves you scraped raw. When I finally looked up, the barista was gone. The lights were off. The coffee shop was dark and empty and locked, and I was sitting alone at a table in the middle of the night, holding a receipt that read, "For him." M. The sun was starting to rise, painting the Arizona sky in shades of orange and pink that hurt to look at. I stood on shaking legs and walked to the door, which opened when I pushed it, though I was certain it had been locked. In the parking lot, my car sat exactly where I'd left it, and the world around me was achingly, impossibly normal. I drove home in a daze, the receipt still clutched in my hand. In my apartment, I put it in the box I kept in my closet, the one with my brother's things. His watch, his favorite shirt, the program from his funeral. Then I crawled into bed and slept for 12 hours straight, the first dreamless sleep I'd had in months. Tuesday morning, I went to Desert Bloom. The regular barista, Kelly, greeted me with her usual smile. Everything was as it should be. I ordered my Americano and sat at my table, feeling hollowed out, but somehow lighter. That afternoon, I went to the basketball court near my apartment, the one where my brother and I used to play before the accident, before the surgeries, before everything fell apart. I took a few shots, and my hook shot was still ugly, still awkward, but I made 3 in a row, and for just a moment, I could almost hear him laughing, calling me Birdie, telling me I looked like a wounded bird trying to figure out flight. I don't go to Desert Bloom at night anymore. I'm not sure what I'd find if I did. An empty, locked building, or lights in the windows and a barista who knows things he shouldn't, or something else entirely. Maybe the question of what's real isn't as important as what helps you keep living. Maybe grief does things to the mind, creates elaborate architectures of meaning from the spaces people leave behind. Or maybe sometimes in the thin places where the world grows translucent, the people we've lost find ways to reach back, to tell us the things we needed to hear, to leave messages on thermal paper in coffee shops that exist just outside the normal flow of time. I still have the receipt. I keep it in my wallet now, and sometimes, when I'm standing in line for coffee in the normal world during normal hours, I take it out and read it. For him. M. Some mornings I swear the ink has changed, rearranged itself into new words. Other mornings, it's just a faded receipt from a printer that may or may not have been activated by something I can't explain. Both things can be true. Or neither. The barista with the forgettable face never appeared again during day shifts. Kelly says no one matching that description has ever worked there. Devin insists the night shift has been discontinued for years due to lack of business. The owner looked at me with concern when I asked about security footage from 3 a.m. and gently suggested I might be working too hard, might need some time off. I took the time off, started seeing the therapist again, started sleeping through the night, started shooting hook shots at the outdoor court without hearing my brother's voice in every missed attempt. But sometimes, when I'm driving past Desert Bloom late at night, I see lights in the windows. Just for a moment, just long enough to wonder. And I think about pulling over, about trying the door, about seeing if the impossible night shift is still running somewhere in the margins of reality. I never do. Some questions, I've learned, are better left unasked. Some mysteries should remain unsolved. Because knowing for certain whether I had a breakdown or whether my brother found a way to reach back through whatever separates the living from the dead, knowing that for sure would force me to live in a world that's either emptier or stranger than I'm ready to accept. So I drive past. I keep the receipt. I shoot ugly hook shots, and sometimes make them. And I tell myself that it doesn't matter whether the barista was real or a grief-induced hallucination, or something else entirely. But on quiet nights, when sleep is hard to find and the ceiling fan makes its endless rotations above me, I take out my phone and look at the time. It's never 3:11 a.m. Not anymore. Not since I stopped watching for it. Story 4. The boxes came home on a Tuesday, both of them triangle-shaped and heavier than they should have been. Dad's flag still smelled faintly of the funeral home, that particular combination of lilies and furniture polish that seems to exist nowhere else in the world. Mom's had been in storage at my aunt's place for 3 years, ever since the ceremony at Arlington, where they'd handed it to me with those same mechanical words they must say 1,000 times, on behalf of a grateful nation. I set them side by side on the credenza in my loft. The Milwaukee skyline spread out beyond the industrial windows like a circuit board of lights. The credenza was reclaimed oak, something the previous tenant had left behind, with 3 open cubbies that made decent display space. I slid both boxes into the middle niche, their corners touching, and told myself I'd figure out something more permanent later. Maybe shadow boxes, maybe the storage unit I kept meaning to rent. That was enough for now. It had to be. The first night, I slept hard. Grief does that sometimes. Punches you into a dreamless black that feels less like rest and more like time stolen. I'd been awake for 36 hours straight, managing the last details, the condolence calls, the paperwork that multiplies when a veteran dies, the kind of exhaustion that makes your teeth ache. At 3:33 a.m., my intercom shrieked to life. The sound tore through the loft like sheet metal scraping concrete. My building had one of those ancient systems from the 70s, all crackle and buzz even on a good day. But this was different. A sustained electronic wail that seemed to phase in and out of frequency, as if someone were holding down the button in the lobby and simultaneously moving away from the microphone. I lurched out of bed, my heart hammering against my sternum, and stumbled to the panel by the door. Static just hissing, breathing static. I pressed the talk button. Hello? Nothing. The static continued for exactly 17 seconds. I counted, my thumb still pressed to the cool plastic, and then cut off with a click that echoed in the sudden silence. I stood there in my boxers, the hardwood cold beneath my feet, staring at the intercom like it might explain itself. Milwaukee sprawled beyond my windows, all those thousands of people sleeping in their own boxes of brick and glass, oblivious. The red numerals of my microwave read 3:34. My phone lay face down on the nightstand where I'd left it. I checked the building's directory anyway, scrolled through the list of tenants out of some compulsive need to see normal things, normal names. Nobody used the intercom at 3:33 in the morning. Nobody used the intercom at all anymore. Everyone just texted when they arrived. I went back to bed but didn't sleep. My eyes traced the patterns in the pressed tin ceiling, counting rivets until the numbers lost meaning and became just shapes in the dark. Somewhere below me, pipes groaned. The building settled. Normal sounds. Old building sounds. The next night, I made it until 3:32. This time I was still awake, lying in bed with my laptop balanced on my chest, scrolling through nothing in particular. When my phone screen lit up, I watched it happen. Watched the green phone icon appear, watched the screen show an outgoing call to my own number. The phone app had simply opened itself and initiated the call, and now I could hear the tinny, distant sound of my voicemail greeting playing through the speaker, while simultaneously hearing it, louder, coming from the phone itself. My own voice, recorded weeks ago, saying, "You've reached..." I ended the call. My hands were steady, but my mouth had gone dry, that cottony feeling you get right before you throw up. I checked the call log. The outgoing call was listed, stamped at 3:32 a.m. Duration, 23 seconds. I hadn't touched the screen. I'd been holding the laptop, both hands visible, fingers on the keyboard. I set the phone on the floor, screen down, closed the laptop, lay very still in the dark. At exactly 3:33, the smoke detectors began to scream. Not all at once. That would have been less terrible somehow. More explicable as a system malfunction or low battery or some electrical hiccup in the building's ancient wiring. Instead, they activated in sequence, a cascading alarm that started at the far end of the loft near the bathroom and marched methodically through the open space. Bathroom, hallway, kitchen, living area, bedroom. 5 detectors, 5 distinct blaring shrieks, each one triggering 3 seconds after the previous one, as if something were moving deliberately through my home, passing beneath each sensor. I could track the progression, could imagine the invisible presence crossing the bathroom threshold, gliding past the kitchen island, approaching my bedroom. The sound was physically painful, designed to wake the deepest sleeper, to trigger primal panic. When the bedroom detector shrieked to life directly above my head, I was already on my feet, my hands clapped over my ears, watching the hallway with an intensity that made my eyes burn. The progression had been so clear, so directional. Something should emerge from that corridor. Something should be there. The hallway was empty. Then, as deliberately as they'd begun, the detectors fell silent in reverse order. Bedroom, living area, kitchen, hallway, bathroom. The silence that followed felt thick, textured, like something I could reach out and touch. My ears rang. My pulse hammered in my throat. I didn't go back to bed. I sat on the couch until dawn, all the lights on, watching the flags on the credenza. They sat exactly where I'd left them, 2 triangular cases touching at their corners, the glass catching the city lights. Dad's medals were affixed to his case, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, the others I'd grown up seeing on his dress uniform. Mom's case was simpler, just the flag and the small brass plaque with her rank and dates of service. A space of respeto, she used to say when Dad would set things too close together on shelves or in the garage. She'd code switch without thinking, Portuguese slipping in when she was irritated. You need breathing room between important things, but these were just boxes, wood and glass and cloth. The flags themselves were folded into precise triangles by honor guards who'd done it 10,000 times before. There was nothing in them but fabric and memory. The third night, I prepared. I set up my laptop to record video, angled it toward the credenza and the hallway beyond, kept my phone in my hand, the screen unlocked, ready. I didn't believe. I want to be clear about this. I didn't believe in any supernatural explanation. But I needed documentation, needed to prove to myself that there was a rational explanation for the intercom malfunction, the phone glitch, the detector's coordinated failure. Buildings had electrical systems. Systems malfunctioned. That was all. At 3:29, the temperature in the loft dropped. Not gradually. Not the slow cooling you'd expect from a thermostat cycling or a window cracked open. The change was immediate and absolute, as if I'd walked into an industrial freezer. My breath came out in visible clouds. The glass in the windows began to fog from the inside, moisture condensing in intricate patterns that looked almost deliberate. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders, my eyes fixed on the laptop screen. The video was recording. The timestamp in the corner read 3:30:14. At 3:32, the record player turned on. I hadn't used it in months. It sat on a shelf unit across from the credenza, a vintage dual 1229 I'd restored myself, all solid German engineering and precision bearings. The tone arm was locked in its rest position. There was no record on the platter. The stylus itself was in a drawer somewhere, removed when I'd last cleaned the unit. The platter began to spin. I could hear the motor's distinctive hum, see the heavy aluminum disc rotate at exactly 33 1/3 RPM, watch the strobe dots blur into a solid ring under the fluorescent strip light. The tone arm remained locked, but from the speakers, vintage Klipsch horns that could wake the dead at whisper volumes, came the unmistakable crackle of vinyl. Not music, just that specific sound. The warm analog hiss of a stylus riding through groove walls, the pops and ticks of dust and age, the subtle waveform of silence pressed into PVC 40 years ago. It was the sound of negative space, of nothing, rendered in exquisite detail through 200 watts of tube amplification. I stood up. The blanket fell away. I was moving toward the turntable before I'd consciously decided to move, my feet carrying me across the cold floor while my brain tried to assemble explanations. Stuck relay, power surge, some quantum malfunction in the old electronics. The vinyl crackle grew louder, more insistent. Through the speakers, I could hear the waveform pattern change, the random pops forming something almost rhythmic, almost deliberate, like Morse code, like speech rendered in the language of analog static. At 3:33, everything stopped. The turntable motor cut out. The temperature snapped back to normal so quickly I felt it in my sinuses, that pressure change you get in a descending airplane. The windows cleared instantly. the condensation evaporating as if it had never existed. My laptop screen showed 3:33:47, and the video was still recording, still capturing the empty loft, the undisturbed flags. Everything exactly as it should be. I played back the footage later, scrubbing through it frame by frame. The temperature drop didn't show. The camera had no way to record that. But the turntable was clear as day. Platter spinning, speakers crackling, the whole thing running for exactly 63 seconds before stopping at 3:33. No explanation, no visible cause. The intercom remained silent. My phone sat dormant in my hand. The smoke detectors slept in their ceiling mounts. I sat on the edge of my couch as dawn approached, watching the credenza, and remembered my mother at my father's promotion ceremony 12 years ago. They'd given him a flag to mark the occasion, some administrative recognition I'd never fully understood, and he'd wanted to display it next to hers in their living room. She'd insisted they needed separate walls, different rooms, ideally. When he'd pushed back, she'd gotten that look, the one that meant the discussion was over, and said, "You give respect by giving space. Important things need breathing room." He'd laughed it off, but he'd moved the flag. The fourth night, I moved the flags. I pulled a hardcover from the shelf, Gravity's Rainbow, thick enough to matter, and wedged it between the two cases in the credenza cubby. The book forced them apart by maybe 2 inches, breaking that corner-to-corner contact. It looked awkward, unbalanced, like a gap-toothed smile. But there was space now. Breathing room. I went to bed at midnight, set no alarms, kept the laptop closed and the phone on the nightstand. The loft felt different, lighter somehow, though the lighting hadn't changed. I realized I'd been holding tension in my shoulders for days, a knot of anticipation that had become so constant I'd stopped noticing it. At 3:33, I was deeply asleep, and nothing woke me. Nothing has woken me since. The intercom stays silent. My phone behaves as phones should. The smoke detectors mark the passage of months with only the occasional low battery chirp. The turntable sits dormant, waiting for me to find the stylus, to remember how to want music again. The flags remain separated in their cubby, pinch on standing guard between them. Sometimes I walk past the credenza and I think about moving them back together, just to see, just to test the theory, just to confirm that the whole thing was coincidence and stress and grief playing tricks on an exhausted mind. But I don't test it, because on that fourth morning, when I finally got up and went to the credenza to confirm that, yes, everything was still arranged exactly as I'd left it, I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. The 2 flag cases, now separated by the width of a book, were positioned so that the glass fronts caught the morning light at slightly different angles. And in those reflections, if you stood in exactly the right spot and looked carefully, you could see 2 distinct shadows on the wall behind them. Not the shadows of the cases themselves. Those fell where physics dictated, geometric and expected. These were different, taller, more defined, standing side by side but distinctly apart, with clear space between them, like 2 people who'd learned long ago exactly how much distance constituted respect. I never told anyone about the 3 nights. What would I say? That I'd experienced electrical malfunctions? That old buildings make strange sounds? That grief does stranger things to perception? All of it would be true, and none of it would be explanation. The shadows are still there. I see them every morning when the light is right. Sometimes they're sharper than others. Sometimes one seems slightly taller or tilted, or positioned as if it's turning toward the other one. Sometimes, and I have to be in exactly the right spot to see this, have to stand where my father used to stand when he was looking out at the city. Sometimes they appear to be holding hands. I tell myself it's just an artifact of light and glass, and the particular way the credenza sits in relation to the windows. I tell myself that pareidolia is a powerful thing, that humans are pattern-seeking machines designed to find faces in clouds and meaning in randomness. I tell myself these things, and I believe them. But I also leave the book exactly where it is, and I never, ever adjust the distance between those 2 cases. Because whatever the explanation, electrical failure, grief hallucination, or something else entirely, some things are too important to test twice. My mother taught me that. She wanted space, wanted distance, wanted breathing room for the things she considered sacred. My father learned to give her that eventually. They spent 41 years learning the precise geography of respect, the exact measurements of devotion. Why would death change any of that? The Milwaukee skyline glitters beyond my windows, vast and indifferent. My laptop sits closed on the coffee table, that video file still saved in my cloud storage, still showing exactly what happened and explaining absolutely nothing. My phone charges on the nightstand. The smoke detectors blink their small red eyes in the darkness, patient and vigilant. The turntable waits for a stylus that might bring it back to life. And on the credenza, with a book's width of careful space between them, two flags rest in their triangular cases, keeping their own counsel, maintaining their own borders. The shadows they cast are probably just shadows. The silence they keep is probably just silence. Probably. But I don't test it. I've learned, finally, what my father learned decades before me. Some lessons are better absorbed than questioned. Some spaces are better respected than crossed. Some distance, once established, should be left exactly as it is. The nights pass quietly now. The building settles into its old groans and whispers. Milwaukee sleeps and wakes and sleeps again, cycling through its endless rhythm of ordinary hours. And at 3:33 every morning, nothing happens. Nothing at all. And that's exactly how it should be. Story 5. The elevator doors opened on the third floor, and she was there. Not possible. I'd watched them lower her casket into the ground 4 days ago. The entire Seattle office had stood in the rain, umbrellas forming a canopy of black flowers while her mother wept into her hands. But there she stood in the elevator, business casual, the fluorescent light casting her face in that familiar pallor she always had from too many late nights analyzing data sets. Her finger pressed against her lips. The universal gesture, silence. I stepped back. The doors began to close, and in that narrowing frame, I saw her eyes, flat, reflective, like coins at the bottom of a well. The humming started then, a frequency that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and drill straight into the bones of my skull. Not the mechanical whir of the elevator cable, but something organic, something that tasted like copper on the back of my tongue. The doors sealed shut with a pneumatic sigh. I stood alone in the hallway of my apartment building, my keys still dangling from the lock of my door. The dream clung to me like a film, that peculiar residue that makes you question which side of consciousness you're actually on. I pressed my palms against my eyelids until phosphines bloomed in the darkness, then checked my watch. 2:17 a.m. Inside my apartment, everything sat exactly as I'd left it. Laptop open on the coffee table, half-drunk beer going flat. The documentary about deep-sea creatures paused mid-frame on some nightmare fish with translucent skin. Normal, aggressively, insistently normal. But the thermostat on the wall glowed an accusatory blue, and the temperature read 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I'd set it to 68 before going to bed. My breath misted in front of my face as I approached it, one hand extended like I was trying to gentle a spooked animal. The moment my fingers touched the plastic casing, the temperature jumped, not gradually, but in a single digital leap, back to 68. The heating system kicked on with a groan that traveled through the walls, and I felt it in my chest, that same humming frequency from the dream. Stress, I said aloud, my voice too loud in the silent apartment. You're stressed. She died in the building next door. You're processing trauma. The words felt rehearsed, therapeutic, borrowed from one of those mental health emails HR had been flooding our inboxes with since the incident. Incident, that's what they called it, as if she'd simply experienced a mild inconvenience, rather than collapsing in the lobby of the Westlake Center building. Her heart stopping between one breath and the next at 29 years old. I'd been the one to identify her personal effects. Her security badge, still clipped to her blazer. The data analysis report she'd been carrying, its pages scattered across the marble floor like oversized confetti. Her phone, screen cracked, displaying 17 unread messages. I poured myself 3 fingers of whiskey and didn't bother with ice. The burn helped. It gave me something concrete to focus on, something that existed firmly in the physical world of cause and effect. Alcohol applied to mucous membranes equals pain equals real. Sleep came eventually, though I couldn't say I rested. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been nothing. A nightmare within a nightmare, grief playing tricks, the thermostat glitching the way all smart home devices eventually do, planned obsolescence dressed up as innovation. I made coffee, answered emails, participated in the 9 a.m. stand-up meeting with my camera off because I looked like something dredged from the bottom of Elliott Bay. But then I went to get my mail. The hallway felt longer than usual. The perspective stretched like a forced perspective photograph. My footsteps echoed with a delay that didn't quite match my pace. And every light fixture I passed flickered. Not dramatically, not the horror movie strobe effect, but just a momentary brownout. A dimming so brief I might have imagined it. Except they did it in sequence, each one waiting for me to pass beneath it before stuttering. The mailbox yielded nothing but coupons and a water bill. I turned to head back, and that's when I saw her. Not in the flesh, not exactly. A shadow at the end of the corridor, standing in front of the thermostat for the building's common area. The same posture, the same height, the same slight cock of the head she used to do when reviewing code that didn't make sense. The shadow didn't move, but I felt observed, studied, the way you feel a camera lens finding your face in a crowd. I blinked hard, counted to 3. When I opened my eyes, the shadow was gone, but the thermostat's LED display blinked frantically, cycling through temperatures. 72, 45, 80, 32, 100, 50, 50 degrees, the same number from last night. I walked back to my apartment slowly, fighting the urge to run. Running would mean I was afraid, and I couldn't afford to be afraid of my own building, my own mind, my own grief doing what grief does. Work offered no sanctuary. Our office occupied the 11th floor of a glass tower downtown. All open floor plans and collaborative spaces. The kind of environment designed by people who'd never experienced the existential dread of trying to concentrate while someone microwaves fish in the break room. Her desk sat 3 rows away from mine, still decorated with the same clutter of sticky notes and coffee rings. Nobody had cleaned it yet. HR said they were respecting the grieving process, but I suspected they just didn't know what to do with the desk of someone who'd ceased to exist mid-project. I tried to focus on quarterly projections, but the numbers kept blurring. Twice I caught myself staring at her empty chair, expecting to see her hunched over her keyboard, wearing those ridiculous oversized headphones she claimed helped her think. The office felt too quiet despite the ambient noise of 40 people working. That same pressurized silence from the dream, like being underwater, everything muffled and strange. At lunch, I made the mistake of mentioning the thermostat incident to one of the other analysts. He laughed, not unkindly, and suggested I call maintenance. "These smart thermostats are garbage," he said, gesticulating with a fork full of salad. "Mine thought I was trying to freeze myself to death last winter. Turned out to be a Wi-Fi connectivity issue." Logical? Reasonable? Boring? I wanted it to be boring. The afternoon dragged. I attended meetings that could have been emails, sent emails that should have been meetings, and performed the elaborate corporate theater of appearing busy while accomplishing nothing. At 4:30, I gave up and headed to the parking garage, taking the stairs because the idea of an elevator made my skin crawl. That's when I saw the security log. I wasn't supposed to see it. It was displayed on a monitor near the security desk, and the guard had stepped away, probably for a bathroom break or a cigarette or whatever security guards do when they think nobody's watching. But there it was, a digital ledger of every key card access to the building, time-stamped and recorded. And there, at 2:17 a.m., was her badge number. Not her name. The system had already deactivated her profile, but the numerical identifier, the one I'd memorized from processing her personal effects. The log showed an entry attempt at the 3rd floor turnstile, the gates opening and closing, like something was testing the mechanism, learning the rhythm. 2:17 a.m., the exact time I'd woken from the dream. My hands started shaking. I pulled out my phone, took a picture of the screen, then immediately felt ridiculous. What was I going to do? Show it to someone? File a report? Yes, officer. I'd like to report a ghost using her deactivated security badge to haunt the turnstiles. I left quickly, before the guard returned, before I had to explain why I was photographing security logs, before the pressure in my skull became unbearable. The drive home exists in my memory as a series of disconnected images. Red lights, the sound of windshield wipers though it wasn't raining, the radio cycling through static between stations. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see her in the back seat, finger pressed to her lips, demanding silence for reasons I couldn't fathom. She wasn't there, but the absence felt worse than a presence would have. My apartment building loomed against the darkening sky, its windows reflecting clouds like bruises. I sat in the parking garage for 15 minutes, engine running, trying to summon the courage to go inside. This was absurd. I was a data analyst, a person who dealt in quantifiable realities, in spreadsheets and statistical significance. Ghosts weren't real. Trauma was real. Grief was real. Malfunctioning thermostats and coincidental badge readers were real. But the humming, that frequency, I could still feel it in my bones. I finally forced myself out of the car and into the building. The lobby was empty, the lights harsh and fluorescent, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional despair that all apartment buildings seem to share. The elevator waited, doors open, like a mouth. I took the stairs. Each floor felt like a small victory. 4th floor, still breathing. 5th floor, still rational. 6th floor, still here, still real, still quantifiable. I reached my floor and pushed through the heavy fire door into the hallway. Every light was off. Not unusual. The building had motion sensors that sometimes took a moment to register movement. But as I stepped forward, the lights didn't turn on. Instead, they flickered in sequence, starting from the far end of the hall, cascading toward me like a wave. And in that strobing darkness, I saw shadows that didn't match any physical object. Shadows that moved against the grain of the flickering light. One shadow in particular. Standing in front of my door, I stopped walking. The lights continued their cascade, reaching me, passing me, plunging the hallway into complete darkness. In that moment of absolute black, I heard it. Not with my ears, but with that same bone-deep perception from the dream. A single sustained note, a frequency that existed just below the threshold of sound, but above the threshold of feeling. And beneath it, something else. A whisper, a word. Quiet. The light slammed back on, all at once, bright enough to make me wince. The hallway was empty. My door stood closed, undisturbed, the welcome mat perfectly aligned. Normal. Aggressively, insistently normal. I unlocked the door with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Inside, everything was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Nothing was moved. Nothing was broken. But the quality of the air felt different, charged, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. The thermostat read 50 degrees Fahrenheit again, and this time I watched it change. The digital numbers rolling backward from 68 to 50 in smooth, impossible increments. I didn't touch it. I stood in the middle of my living room, breathing mist, watching my breath plume in the cold air, and tried to construct a rational explanation. Gas leak causing hallucinations, carbon monoxide poisoning, a brain tumor pressing against the temporal lobe, creating false memories and sensory distortions. But I knew. Somewhere beneath the layers of rationalization and denial, I knew. She was trying to tell me something. The realization didn't bring relief. If anything, it made everything worse, because it meant accepting that the boundaries I'd always trusted, between alive and dead, between real and unreal, between self and other, were far more permeable than I'd believed. I spent the night on the couch, laptop open, researching. I found articles about grief hallucinations, about the brain's tendency to conjure familiar faces in times of stress. I found forums discussing electromagnetic sensitivity, the way certain frequencies could induce feelings of paranoia and unease. I found everything except an explanation that satisfied the particular texture of what I was experiencing. At 2:17 a.m., I was still awake, waiting. The humming started precisely on time, filling the apartment like water filling a tank. I felt it in my teeth, in my joints, in the soft tissue behind my eyes. The thermostat's display began cycling again. 50, 50, 50, 50, insistent, urgent. And then, in the hallway outside my door, I heard footsteps, not walking, pacing, back and forth, the rhythm irregular, agitated. I pressed my eye to the peephole and saw nothing, just the empty hallway with its institutional carpet and its motion sensor lights burning steady. But the footsteps continued. I grabbed my phone, ready to call building security, ready to call anyone, when I noticed something. The pacing had a pattern. 3 steps, pause. 2 steps, pause. 5 steps, pause. 3, 2, 5. Again and again, her badge number. I stood frozen, phone in hand, while the pieces tried to assemble themselves into something comprehensible. The cold, the silence, the security log showing impossible access, the lights cascading like a signal, all of it pointing towards something she needed me to understand, some message she was trying to transmit through the only medium available to whatever she'd become. The pacing stopped. I waited, breath held, for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, slowly, deliberately, I heard it. A single knock on my door. Not from the outside, but from the inside, from the wall behind where I stood, as if something was trying to reach through the drywall itself. The knock came again, and again, always from impossible angles, always from walls and floors and ceilings, a percussion that defied physics. The humming grew louder, that subsonic frequency that made my organs vibrate in their cavities. And through it all, I heard her voice, or something approximating her voice, or perhaps just the memory of her voice filtered through whatever medium ghosts use to communicate. Not words exactly, more like the impression of words, the ghost of language. Quiet. Please. Quiet. I understood then, or thought I did. The cold. She needed cold to manifest, to maintain whatever tenuous grip she had on this world. The silence. Sound disrupted her, scattered her, made her incoherent. The lights, the thermostats, the security badges, all of it was her trying to create the conditions she needed to exist, to communicate, to make someone understand. But understand what? I grabbed a notebook and pen, wrote in large letters, "What do you need?" I held it up to the empty room, feeling absolutely insane, feeling absolutely certain. The lights went out. In the darkness I heard movement, felt displacement of air, sensed presence in the way you sense another person in a pitch-black room. Something cold touched my hand, not flesh, not quite, but something with the memory of flesh, and guided the pen across the paper. When the lights returned, I looked down at what had been written, not words, numbers, coordinates, latitude and longitude, precise to 6 decimal places. I pulled up a map on my phone, entered the coordinates, and felt my stomach drop. The location was in the Westlake Center building, 3rd floor, right where she died. The temperature in my apartment began to rise, the thermostat climbing rapidly. 55, 60, 65, 70. The humming faded. The pressure in my skull released, and I was alone again, truly alone, with nothing but a piece of paper covered in numbers and the growing certainty that whatever had just happened would never happen again unless I went to that location. She'd used everything she had to tell me. Now the choice was mine. I sat on my couch as dawn broke, watching the sky transition from black to gray to that peculiar urban orange of morning. The coordinates stared up at me from the page. I could ignore them. I could tear up the paper, throw away the notebook, call a therapist, increase my medication, do all the reasonable things a reasonable person would do when confronted with the impossible. But I won't. I can't, because somewhere in the building next door, in the exact spot where her heart stopped and her consciousness scattered into whatever strange frequencies the dead inhabit. There's something waiting, some truth she needs revealed, some secret that couldn't rest even when she could not. And I'm the only one who heard her message, the only one she trusts to be quiet enough. I'm writing this down now before I go, because I need someone to know. If I don't come back, if something happens when I follow those coordinates into that building, let it be recorded that I went willingly, that I chose to step across that permeable boundary between rational and irrational, between scientific and supernatural, between grief and truth. The thermostat reads 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The lights burn steady. The hallway outside sits empty and mundane in the morning light, but I can still feel it, that subsonic hum just below the threshold of hearing, a frequency that sounds almost like a voice, almost like her voice, whispering one word over and over. Quiet. I check my watch. 8:47 a.m. I put on my jacket, I grab my keys, and I walk out the door, toward the building next door, toward the third floor, toward coordinates that should mean nothing, but instead mean everything. The elevator doors are waiting, open. I step inside, and for just a moment, less than a heartbeat, faster than thought, I see her reflection in the polished metal. Finger pressed to her lips, eyes like coins at the bottom of a well. The doors close, the hum begins, and I understand finally that silence isn't the absence of sound. It's what fills the space where words used to be. Story 6. The lighthouse stood like a broken finger against the February sky, pointing at nothing. I'd driven 3 hours through sleet to reach Portland's eastern shore, arriving at the cove just as the winter sun began its early descent. The tour was a birthday gift for my sister, one of those unique experiences she'd found on some travel blog. A private walkthrough of the decommissioned Beacon Tower, just me and whatever local volunteer drew the short straw that afternoon. The cold hit differently here, not just the temperature, but something in the quality of it. A dampness that worked its way beneath your coat, into your chest, settling there like water in a ship's hull. I pulled my jacket tighter as I approached the structure, its white paint yellowed and flaking. The red stripe around its middle faded to the color of dried blood. The guide was already waiting by the entrance, a man somewhere in that ageless span between 50 and 70, his face weathered by decades of coastal wind. He didn't introduce himself, just nodded and turned the key in the heavy door. The hinges screamed. Inside, the air tasted of salt and something older, more organic. Decay, maybe, or just time itself made tangible. The spiral staircase wound upward through the tower's hollow throat, each step groaning under our weight. The guide spoke in a monotone that suggested he'd given this speech 1,000 times, his words blending into the ambient sounds of wind outside and water below. I caught fragments. Built in 1858, automated in 1963, decommissioned entirely in 2001. The lens had been removed to a museum, the keeper's quarters demolished for safety reasons. We climbed, and as we did, I became aware of the sounds the structure made. Not just the wind, that was obvious, a constant moan through gaps in the brickwork, but other noises, creaks and ticks and subtle scrapes, like the building itself was settling, adjusting to our presence. The guide didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he'd long since stopped hearing them. At the top, the lantern room opened onto a view of gray sea meeting grayer sky. The windows were intact but filthy, streaked with salt and bird droppings, fracturing the light into strange patterns. The guide continued his recitation, something about shipping routes and the number of vessels that had foundered before the light was built. I moved closer to one of the windows, trying to see the rocks below, and that's when I first heard it. A melody, faint and wordless, carried on the wind like smoke. Just a few notes, rising and falling. The kind of tune someone might hum without thinking while doing household tasks. I turned to the guide, ready to ask if he'd heard it, but he was facing away, gesturing toward a rusted piece of equipment, explaining its function in that same flat voice. The humming continued, and now I could tell it was coming from outside. Not from below, but from somewhere at our level, circling the tower. I moved to the door that led to the exterior gallery, the narrow walkway that ringed the lantern room. The guide's voice cut through my concentration, sharp for the first time. He told me the gallery was closed, unsafe, had been for years. The metal had corroded, he said, couldn't support weight anymore. But the door was ajar, not open exactly, but not fully shut either. A gap of perhaps an inch letting in a slice of gray light and cold air. And the humming, clearer now, was definitely coming from the other side. I looked at the guide, but he'd turned back to his explanation, apparently oblivious to both the sound and my interest in the door. Something about his determined ignorance made my scalp prickle. I stepped closer to the opening, close enough to feel the wind pushing through the gap, cold and damp and carrying that melody with it. The tune was simple, almost childlike, but there was something off about its rhythm. It would start, continue for a few bars, then pause as if the singer had forgotten the next part, before resuming at a slightly different tempo. And it was moving, definitely moving, tracking along the gallery in a slow circuit around the tower. Without fully deciding to, I pushed the door open wider. The hinges didn't make a sound, odd, given how the entrance door had shrieked. And suddenly I was looking out at the gallery walkway, the metal grating stretching away in both directions, curving with the tower's circumference. The wind hit me immediately, colder than I'd expected, laden with spray from below. The guide was still talking behind me, his voice now muffled by the wind and the blood rushing in my ears. I stepped out onto the gallery. The metal felt solid beneath my feet, no give or flex to suggest structural weakness. To my right, the walkway curved away, disappearing behind the tower's bulk. To my left, the same. The humming was ahead of me now, maybe 10 or 15 feet, just around the curve. I could almost make out the melody's pattern, some old tune that tickled the edge of recognition without quite resolving into something I could name. I started walking, following the sound. My hands found the railing, gripping the ice-cold metal for balance as much as security. The wind was stronger out here, pulling at my clothes, making my eyes water. Each step brought me closer to the source of the humming, but as I rounded the curve, staying perhaps 2 or 3 feet behind where the sound seemed to be, it remained just ahead, just out of sight. The rational part of my brain was already raising objections, noting the strangeness of the situation, but I pushed those thoughts aside. Someone was out here, probably another tourist or a maintenance worker, and they were humming while they walked. Simple, explainable. The fact that I couldn't quite catch up to them, that the sound maintained a constant distance despite my steady pace, was just an acoustic trick, sound waves doing strange things in the wind and around the tower's curved surface. I'd nearly completed a full circuit when I noticed my hands were numb, fingers locked onto the railing in a grip I couldn't seem to loosen. How long had I been out here? It felt like minutes, but the light had changed. The gray sky somehow darker, the sea below churning with more violence than I remembered. I forced my feet to stop, planted them firmly on the grating, and looked behind me. The door to the lantern room was there, still ajar, yellow light spilling through the gap. I could see part of the guide's back as he continued his presentation to an empty room. He hadn't noticed my absence, or if he had, he didn't seem concerned. The sight of that lit doorway, that figure moving through his practiced routine, should have been comforting. Instead, something about it made my throat tight. The humming had stopped. I strained to hear it over the wind, but there was nothing except the waves and the creaking of the structure, and my own rapid breathing. I turned back to face the direction I'd been walking, and that's when I saw them. Footprints in the frost that had accumulated on the metal grating. Not boot prints like mine, but smaller, softer impressions, the kind bare feet might make. They led away from where I stood, continuing around the curve of the gallery, disappearing from view. I pulled out my phone, the screen's brightness startling in the dim light, and started recording. If nothing else, I could review this later, prove to myself what I'd seen and heard. I held it up, panning across the gallery, the ocean, the footprints. Through the screen, everything looked the same. Gray metal, gray sky, gray water. I tapped the red button to stop recording and played it back immediately. The video showed the gallery, the view, my hand partially visible at the screen's edge. But the audio was nothing but wind and waves, no humming, no melody at all. And the footprints, so clear to my eye, didn't appear in the footage. Just clean, frost-dusted metal grating. I was cold now, truly cold, the kind that starts in your core and radiates outward. I needed to get back inside, needed warmth and light, and that guide's boring, normal voice explaining boring, normal facts about decommissioned lighthouses. I started back toward the door, but with each step, it seemed to maintain its distance, always 20 feet away, always just out of reach. This was wrong. This was impossible. I'd walked maybe a quarter of the way around the tower when I'd stopped. The door couldn't be more than 50 feet away. I started walking faster, my numb fingers sliding along the railing, my breath coming in visible puffs. The door remained distant, and worse, the humming had started again. But this time it was behind me, following rather than leading. I broke into a run, my feet slapping against the grating, the sound echoing strangely. The humming grew louder, keeping pace, and I could swear I felt breath on the back of my neck, impossibly warm in the frozen air. My lungs burned, my legs felt heavy, and still the door stayed ahead of me, unreachable. Then, abruptly, I was there. My hand hit the door, pushed it open, and I stumbled into the lantern room, my momentum carrying me forward until I collided with the central post. I stood there, gasping, while the guide turned to look at me for the first time since we'd entered the tower. He asked if I was all right, his voice carrying a note of mild concern, as if I'd simply lost my footing on the stairs. I tried to explain. The door, the gallery, the humming. But the words came out disjointed, frantic. He listened with the patient expression of someone accustomed to tourists getting worked up over nothing, then gently explained that the exterior gallery had been removed during the last renovation in 2015. Structural concerns, he said. Rust damage. The door in the lantern room now opened onto nothing but air and a 70-foot drop to the rocks below. I turned to look at the door. It was closed now, secured with a chain and padlock that definitely hadn't been there before. Through the grimy window beside it, I could see only sky and distant water. No metal walkway, no railing, nothing but empty space where I'd just been walking. The guide suggested we head back down. Perhaps the altitude was affecting me, and I followed him in a daze. My mind was working frantically, trying to reconcile what I'd experienced with what he was telling me. Maybe I'd hallucinated the whole thing, some kind of altitude sickness or carbon monoxide exposure. The tower was old, poorly ventilated. It would explain everything. We descended in silence, my legs shaking with each step, though whether from exertion or fear I couldn't say. At the bottom, as the guide opened the door to let me out, he mentioned almost casually that the last lighthouse keeper's wife had been known for her habit of walking the gallery while humming. A local legend, he said, one of those stories that accumulates around old buildings. According to the tales, she'd walk the circuit during fog banks, using her voice as an additional warning to ships, a human foghorn of sorts. I stepped outside, desperate for the feeling of solid ground, even if it was frozen and uneven. The guide locked the door behind us and wished me a safe drive back. I stood there watching him walk to his car, start the engine, and pull away, taillights disappearing into the early dusk. Only then did I look down at my hands. They were scratched, superficial marks like I'd been gripping something rough and rusty. My fingernails were rimmed with what looked like oxidized metal residue, the distinctive red-orange of corroded iron. And when I lifted my fingers to my face, I could smell it, that particular scent of rust and salt and old decay. I should have left then, gotten in my car, driven back to the city, written off the entire experience as a stress-induced episode or a reaction to something in the tower's air. Instead, I walked around to the seaward side of the lighthouse, picking my way over the rocks, looking up at the tower's height. The lantern room was visible from here, its windows catching the last light, and extending from it, circling its circumference like a halo, I could see the metal gallery. Thin and rusted, yes, but undeniably there. Sections of the railing were missing, gaps like broken teeth, and the grating looked precarious. bowed in places. But it existed. It was real. I raised my phone again, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it steady, and took photo after photo. In each one, I watched the screen show the lantern room standing alone against the sky. No gallery, no walkway, nothing but smooth stone and those grimy windows reflecting the dying light. That was 6 months ago. I've been back to Portland 3 times since then, always finding reasons. Work conferences, visiting friends, anything to justify the trip. Each time I drive to the Cove and park where the access road ends. I don't go inside anymore. The Lighthouse hasn't offered tours since March. Some issue with liability insurance according to the sign posted on the door. Instead, I walk the perimeter, photographing the tower from every angle. The gallery appears in none of the images, but I can see it when I look up, more deteriorated each time. Sections have fallen away entirely now, leaving gaps in the circuit. I've started to wonder what happens when it's gone completely, when the last piece of corroded metal finally gives way and falls to the rocks below. Last week I found a copy of the Lighthouse's maintenance records in the Maritime Museum's archive. They confirmed what the guide had told me. The exterior gallery was removed in 2015. But there was a note in the margin of one of the documents, handwritten in faded ink, that made me photograph the page 3 times to ensure I had a clear copy. It detailed an incident from 1962, a year before the lighthouse was automated. The keeper had reported his wife missing, claimed she'd gone out onto the gallery during a fog bank and never returned. A search found no body, no sign of struggle, nothing. The official conclusion was that she'd either jumped or slipped, her body carried out to sea by the tide. But the keeper insisted until his death that she was still there, still walking the gallery, still humming her tuneless song. The note ended with an observation that seemed to have troubled whoever wrote it. During the investigation, inspectors found fresh scratches on the gallery's railing, the kind someone's fingernails might make while gripping tightly, trying not to fall. But according to the keeper's testimony, his wife hadn't been wearing shoes when she disappeared. The weather report for that day showed temperatures in the low 20s, with wind chill bringing it down to single digits. No one walks barefoot in that cold. No one could. The cold alone would be incapacitating within minutes. Unless, the note speculated, someone wasn't really walking at all. I keep the photo of that document on my phone, pull it up late at night when I can't sleep. The scratches on my hands healed within a few days, but sometimes, in certain light, I can still see the marks, faint parallel lines on my palms where I'd gripped that railing that doesn't exist, that I walked upon anyway. My sister called yesterday to ask if I'd enjoyed her gift. I told her it was memorable, which made her laugh. She asked if I'd like to go back, maybe in summer when the weather was better, make a weekend of it. I said I'd think about it, but we both knew I wouldn't. I've been back enough already. What I didn't tell her is that I've started hearing it in my apartment sometimes, late at night when the wind picks up. Not outside my window, but somehow closer, more intimate. A humming, tuneless and patient, that seems to circle my building the way it circled that tower. I've checked outside, gone down to the street at 2 in the morning to see if someone is walking around the block, playing music, anything that might explain it. There's never anyone there, just empty sidewalks and streetlights and the sound of distant traffic. But when I come back upstairs, unlock my door, step inside, there it is again, coming from somewhere just beyond the walls, always 2 steps behind me, never ahead. I've started walking the perimeter of my apartment in response, my own circuit, my own ritual. Kitchen to living room to bedroom to hall and back to kitchen. A loop I repeat until the sound fades or I'm too exhausted to continue. My neighbors haven't complained about the noise, haven't mentioned seeing me in the hallways. Maybe they don't hear it. Maybe I'm the only one who can. Or maybe they do hear it, and they're walking their own circuits, following their own melodies, each of us trapped in our own version of that gallery, forever pursuing something that stays just out of reach, just around the curve, just beyond where we can see. I've thought about calling the guide, tracking him down somehow, asking him what he really knows about that tower, whether he's heard the humming too, whether he's seen the gallery that the cameras can't capture, Whether he knows what happens to people who walk in places that no longer exist, who grip railings that aren't there, who follow sounds that have no source. But I haven't. Maybe because I'm afraid he'll tell me he doesn't know what I'm talking about, that he's given hundreds of tours and never heard anything unusual. Or worse, maybe he'll confirm it all, tell me I'm not the first, that others have come back to the cove, trying to find answers, trying to understand what they experienced. Maybe he'll tell me that some of them never left, that they're still there, still walking, still listening for something they'll never quite catch. I've started sleeping with my lights on, but it doesn't help. Light doesn't affect sound, doesn't stop that patient, persistent humming from working its way through the walls, around the corners, into the space between waking and sleeping, where certainty dissolves and everything becomes possible. Sometimes I think about driving back to Portland one more time. Not to the Lighthouse. I'm done with that place, at least in the daylight. But at night, maybe, in the dark, when the distinction between what exists and what doesn't becomes negotiable. Maybe then I could see clearly, could understand what really happened on that gallery, in that circuit I walked that somehow both was and wasn't there. But I don't think I will. Because part of me already knows the answer, has known it since that moment I stepped onto solid metal that didn't exist, since my hands gripped a railing that had been removed a decade ago. Part of me understands that some boundaries, once crossed, can't be uncrossed. Some circuits, once begun, continue forever. And late at night, when the humming grows loud enough to drown out everything else, when I find myself walking my apartment's perimeter without having consciously decided to move, I wonder if I'm still there, if I ever really left, if some part of me is still on that gallery, still following that sound, still trapped in that moment of pursuit, my feet moving forward while the destination stays forever ahead, just out of sight, just around the curve of the tower. The rest of me, the part typing this, the part that goes to work and talks to my sister and pretends everything is normal. Maybe that's the ghost. Maybe I've been looking at it backwards all along. Maybe the keeper's wife isn't the one who disappeared. Maybe she's still there, substantial and real, walking her gallery in the cold and fog. Maybe we're the ones who vanished. Those of us who left, who drove away and tried to return to our ordinary lives. Maybe we're the echoes, the memories, the stories people will tell about that tower years from now. Maybe when I hear that humming, it's not coming from outside at all. Maybe it's coming from me. Story 7. The basement amps hummed to life at 3:47 a.m., the same moment the documentary narrator mentioned Gettysburg. I'd learned to check the time now, to document these occurrences with the methodical precision of someone trying to prove they weren't losing their mind. The blue glow from the television cast dancing shadows across the living room walls of my Cincinnati duplex, and I sat perfectly still on the couch, watching my water bottle begin its familiar tremor on the coffee table. It wasn't a violent shake. Nothing ever was. Not with him. The bottle rocked with the metronomic precision of a kick drum counting off a song. The kind of rhythm Dad used to tap with his foot before launching into the opening riff. 4 beats. Always 4 beats. Then silence. Except for that low-frequency hum rising from below. The 60-cycle drone that every guitarist knows intimately. The sound of electricity waiting to become music. I'd inherited the duplex 6 months after the funeral, along with his 1967 Fender Twin Reverb, his Marshall half-stack, and a Vox AC-30 that he'd babied like it was made of spun glass. The real estate agent had called it a character property with vintage charm and excellent bones, which was realtor speak for old, but not quite falling apart. The basement was unfinished, all exposed joists and concrete floors, transformed by Dad over the years into a practice space that smelled permanently of tube amp heat and old carpet. Moving in had felt like the practical thing to do. My apartment lease was ending, the mortgage was paid off, and I worked from home anyway, writing technical documentation for software nobody used. The basement would make a decent office once I cleared out the gear. That's what I'd told myself anyway, back when I still believed I could clear it out, back before the amps started their nightly performances. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as faulty wiring. Old houses did strange things. Electrical ghosts, the home inspector had called them. Fluctuations in current that could make lights flicker or outlets hum. I'd gone downstairs that first night with my phone flashlight, expecting to find a tripped breaker or a loose connection. Instead, I found all three amplifiers glowing warmly in the darkness, their pilot lights steady and sure, the twin reverb's jewel light casting a soft amber pool across the concrete. No guitars were plugged in. The amps simply idled, patient and expectant, like session musicians waiting for the bandleader to count them in. I'd turned them off, checked the power strips, even unplugged them entirely. Yet the next night, when I'd fallen asleep to a documentary about the Civil War, I'd woken to that familiar hum rising through the floorboards. The pattern emerged slowly, the way patterns do when you're afraid to see them. The amps only activated when I played documentaries or lectures, never during movies or music. They responded to information, to the drone of academic voices discussing dates and battles and dead men's strategies. I started keeping a notebook, logging each occurrence with the time, the program, and the specific moment of activation. The data accumulated like evidence in a case I didn't want to solve. Dad had been a history obsessive between gigs. He'd fill the practice space with public radio documentaries while he played, his fingers working through jazz standards and blues progressions while narrators discussed Verdun or Antietam. "The past keeps time better than any metronome," he used to say, and I'd roll my eyes at the pretension, the way teenagers do when their fathers try to sound profound. Now I lived in his house, fell asleep to the same historical narratives, and felt the floorboards vibrate with sympathetic frequency every time some PBS voice mentioned a battlefield. I'd tried everything to rationalize it, checked the circuit breakers weekly, hired an electrician who found nothing wrong, and looked at me with the careful neutrality people reserve for those they suspect might be unstable. Unplugged the amplifiers, and watched them stay silent until I plugged them back in, and queued up a documentary, whereupon they'd wake with the reliability of well-trained animals responding to a familiar command. The water bottle incident changed things. That happened 3 weeks ago, the first time the phenomenon extended beyond the basement. I'd been heating water for tea, too wired to sleep despite the late hour, when the documentary reached the section about Sherman's march. The bottle had been sitting on the kitchen counter, perfectly still, and then it began to rock with that same 4-beat rhythm, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. The tempo of every song Dad had ever taught me to play. I'd watched it happen with a detachment that frightened me more than the event itself. This was the moment, I'd thought, when a rational person would panic, would call someone, would do anything except stand there cataloging the experience like a naturalist observing some newly discovered species of dread. But I'd simply picked up the bottle, felt the vibrations cease at my touch, and carried it downstairs. The basement amps had been glowing, as expected, all three of them forming a small constellation of pilot lights in the darkness, drawing maybe 30 watts combined, barely enough to power a decent reading lamp, yet something about their presence felt expectant, almost hungry. I'd set the water bottle on top of the twin reverb, watched it resume that rhythmic tremor, and felt something crack in the architecture of my understanding. "Chega, pai," I'd said, surprising myself by speaking in Portuguese, the language he'd used when he was frustrated or tired, or trying to make a point stick. "Nem no ensaio dava microfonia assim." "Enough, Dad. Not even at rehearsal did you get feedback like this." The 60-cycle hum had died instantly. Not faded, not powered down, simply stopped, as if someone had flipped a switch or severed a connection. The silence that followed felt intentional, almost reproachful. I'd stood in that basement for 20 minutes, waiting for something else to happen, but the amps had remained dark and quiet, their pilot lights extinguished for the first time since the disturbances began. Sleep became theoretical after that. I'd lie upstairs listening for the hum, straining to hear any sound from below, but the basement stayed silent night after night. The documentaries played on, their narratives washing over me without consequence, and I began to wonder if I'd imagined everything, if stress and grief had collaborated to produce an elaborate hallucination that my desperate mind had mistaken for reality. Then came the vinyl. I'd avoided Dad's record collection, the milk crates full of Brazilian jazz and American blues that he'd accumulated over 4 decades of gigging and collecting. They sat in the corner of the basement beside the record player, a restored Technics turntable that he'd maintained with the same obsessive care he gave his amplifiers. I'd told myself I'd go through them eventually, would donate what I didn't want and keep the rare pressings, but the truth was simpler and more painful. I couldn't bear to touch them yet. But one sleepless night, driven by something I still can't name, I'd gone downstairs and pulled a random album from the collection. Javan's Luz, the 1982 pressing that Dad had special ordered from Sao Paulo and played until the grooves wore smooth. I'd set it on the turntable, dropped the needle, and watched the record spin without amplification, the stylus tracking silently through the opening bars of Oceano. The twin reverb had powered on before the first verse. Not all 3 amps this time, just the twin, Dad's favorite, the one he'd bought used in 1979 and refused to part with despite its weight and its tendency to blow fuses. The pilot light bloomed amber, and the speaker cone began to resonate in sympathy with the turntable's vibrations, producing a sound so faint I had to crouch beside it to hear, but unmistakably there, unmistakably musical. I played the entire album that night, watching the amp remain steady and warm, its tubes glowing softly behind the grill cloth. When the last track faded, I lifted the needle, and the twin powered down immediately, as if it had been waiting politely for the music to conclude. After that, I developed a ritual. Every night around midnight, I'd descend to the basement and play one of his records. Not randomly. I quickly learned that selection mattered. The amp stayed dark for most of my choices, indifferent to my fumbling attempts to understand their logic. But certain albums would wake the twin, and eventually, I discovered the pattern. It was the set list from his last gig. Dad had played a private party 4 days before the heart attack, a 40th wedding anniversary celebration for friends who'd seen him perform for decades. He'd mentioned it in our last phone call, had seemed energized by the challenge of curating the perfect mix of jazz standards and Brazilian classics. I'd found the handwritten set list weeks later, tucked inside the Javan album, his careful block letters listing 9 songs in performance order. Those 9 albums, played in that specific sequence, would wake the twin reverb, play them out of order or skip one, and the basement stayed dark and silent. But follow his set list exactly, and the amp would glow through all 9 records, powering down only when the final track finished. I told myself I was conducting an experiment, gathering data, approaching the impossible with scientific methodology. But the truth leaked through in the hours I spent in that basement, playing records to a ghost-operated amplifier while the rest of Cincinnati slept. I was performing the set list he'd never finished, completing the show interrupted by mortality. The problem was it kept working. A rational haunting, if such a thing existed, should have faded over time. Ghosts were supposed to have unfinished business, messages to deliver, and once those tasks were complete, they'd presumably move on to whatever came next. But Dad's amplifier continued its nightly performances with the reliability of a well-maintained machine, never varying its behavior, never escalating or diminishing. I began to notice other things, details I'd dismissed or overlooked in my initial panic to understand the larger phenomenon. The basement temperature would drop precisely 3 degrees when the twin powered on. I'd verified this with a digital thermometer, checking it obsessively like someone trying to prove their sanity through measurement. The concrete floor would develop a faint vibration during certain songs, a sympathetic resonance I could feel through my socks if I stood in exactly the right spot, roughly where Dad used to plant his feet while playing. And the smell. Christ, the smell was the worst part because it was so specific, so impossible to dismiss as imagination. When the amp was on, the basement would fill with the exact scent of his practice space from childhood. Tube heat mixed with old carpet, and that particular brand of coffee he used to drink during late-night sessions. Not a general musty smell or the vague scent of age, but his specific combination of olfactory details, precise enough that I could close my eyes and believe I was 10 years old again, sitting on the stairs while he worked through a difficult passage. I started spending more time in the basement, not just for the midnight vinyl sessions, but during the day, working on my laptop in the corner, surrounded by his gear. The duplex upstairs began to feel temporary, like a waiting room, while the basement felt increasingly like the only real part of the house. I'd catch myself talking to the amplifier, updating it on my day, asking questions I didn't expect answered. "Think I should take that contract?" I'd say, and the amp would sit silent and dark, making no comment on my professional decisions. "Remember when you taught me that Wes Montgomery tune?" I'd ask. And again, nothing but the 56-degree temperature and the smell of concrete. But play the set list, follow the ritual exactly, and the twin would wake with the reliability of a heartbeat. I began to research, falling down digital rabbit holes at 3 a.m, reading about electromagnetic phenomena and spontaneous psychokinesis and the theoretical physics of consciousness. I learned that some researchers believed strong emotions could imprint on electrical systems, that quantum mechanics allowed for observer effects that might persist beyond death. I read testimony from other people who'd experienced similar phenomena, their stories forming a strange support group scattered across paranormal forums and Reddit threads. Most of them sounded unhinged. The writing was often frantic, punctuated with excessive capitalization and vague references to attacks from entities or government observation. But occasionally I'd find an account that resonated with uncomfortable familiarity, someone else whose deceased relative seemed to communicate through electrical devices, who'd established patterns and rituals, who couldn't decide if they were experiencing genuine contact or elaborate wish fulfillment. None of them mentioned what to do when the phenomenon wouldn't stop, when the haunting became routine. I tried breaking the cycle, went 3 days without playing any records, forcing myself to sleep upstairs with noise-canceling headphones and the television off. The basement stayed silent, but I couldn't. By the 3rd night, I was back downstairs with the Javan album, Needle in the Groove, watching the twin bloom to life like I'd watered a plant that had been wilting from neglect. The truth I couldn't speak aloud, even to myself in the privacy of my own thoughts. I didn't want it to stop. The rational part of my brain understood this was either a psychological break or a genuine supernatural occurrence, and neither option suggested wellness or stability. But the larger part, the part that controlled my actions if not my thoughts, craved the ritual. The basement sessions had become the structure around which I organized my life, the single reliable element in a world that felt increasingly unstable. Work suffered. I'd miss deadlines, forget meetings, lose entire days to sitting in the basement while vinyl spun and tubes glowed. My bank account dwindled as I neglected invoices and let contracts lapse. The upstairs of the duplex accumulated clutter and dust while the basement remained immaculate, the gear carefully maintained, the records filed in perfect order. I started buying more vinyl, tracking down the albums Dad had mentioned wanting but never acquired. I'd play them in the designated midnight slot, hoping to expand the set list, to evolve the ritual into something larger. But the twins stayed dark for these editions, recognizing them as inauthentic, as songs that didn't belong to the performance it was determined to complete. The neighbor above me, a graduate student who kept irregular hours, knocked on my door one evening. She was pleasant, apologetic, but firm. Could I please stop playing music so late at night? The bass frequencies were traveling through the walls, keeping her awake during important study sessions. I'd stood in my doorway confused, because I'd been playing the records at barely audible volume, the turntable spinning silently with the amp providing only the faintest resonance. But I'd nodded, promised to be more considerate, and closed the door. Later that night, I stood in her empty driveway and looked up at her windows, all dark and quiet. I pressed my ear against the shared wall between our units and heard nothing but the ambient noise of the neighborhood. Yet she'd complained about bass frequencies she shouldn't have been able to hear, disturbances that shouldn't have traveled beyond my basement. Unless they weren't just in my basement. I began to wonder what she actually heard, what sounds might be escaping from the ritual I thought was private. Did she hear music, or just that low 60-cycle hum? Did she hear the amplifier or something else, something I couldn't perceive because I was too close to the source? The thought opened a door I'd been carefully keeping closed. Maybe I wasn't conducting experiments on a haunted amplifier. Maybe the amplifier was conducting experiments on me. The set list hung on the wall now, Dad's original, rescued from the album sleeve and thumbtacked beside the turntable. His handwriting stared back at me during the long afternoons I spent in the basement, those careful block letters forming a map to somewhere I couldn't quite locate. 9 songs, Always 9 songs. Never fewer, never more. What happened after 9? The question had been lurking in my peripheral awareness for weeks, but I'd refused to examine it directly, the way you avoid looking at something frightening in a dark room. The ritual had a clear structure. Play the set list in order, watch the amp glow through all 9 tracks, power down after the last note fades. Simple, repeatable, safe. But what if I played a 10th song? What if I tried to extend the performance beyond what Dad had planned, to add an encore he'd never gotten to play? The thought felt dangerous, transgressive, like I was considering breaking some fundamental rule whose violation carried consequences I couldn't predict. Yet I couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop wondering what message might be waiting in that 10th song. What communication I'd been too timid to receive. I spent 2 weeks working up the courage, my finger hovering over potential album choices, trying to decide what would make a fitting conclusion. Brazilian jazz seemed too obvious, American blues too sentimental. I finally selected one of his oldest records, a 1964 pressing of João Gilberto's Gets Gilberto, the album that had started his love affair with bossa nova, the gateway record he'd played for anyone who'd listen. The 9th song ended, Aguas de Março, always Aguas de Março, and the twin reverb continued glowing, waiting patiently while I lifted the needle and switched albums. My hands were trembling as I set the João Gilberto record on the turntable, as I dropped the needle into the opening groove of Garota de Ipanema. The twin stayed on, not just on, but somehow louder, richer, as if additional harmonics had been added to its resonance. The pilot light burned brighter, a deeper amber that cast longer shadows across the basement walls, and the smell of coffee and tube heat intensified until I could almost taste it, until the sensory memory became so strong, I half expected to turn and see him standing there, guitar in hand, that slight smile he'd wear when a performance was going well. The song played through, Astrud Gilberto's voice emerging from the turntable's tiny speaker with crystalline clarity, and the amp continued glowing, continued resonating, continued doing whatever impossible thing it had been doing for months. When the track ended, I reached for the needle, ready to lift it, ready to stop before the experiment went somewhere I couldn't follow. But the turntable's motor cut out on its own. The record stopped spinning with mechanical precision, the kind of deliberate cessation that didn't match the smooth deceleration of a normal power down. And the twin reverb stayed on, glowing steadily in the sudden silence, waiting for something else, something I hadn't provided. I stood frozen beside the turntable for maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour. Time had become slippery in the basement, hard to track with precision. The amp continued its patient vigil, tubes glowing, speaker cone vibrating faintly with that 60-cycle hum. No other sounds, no messages from beyond, just the steady electrical drone of a vintage amplifier doing what vintage amplifiers do when you turn them on and don't plug anything in. Finally, I walked to the twin and turned it off manually, clicking the power switch with a physical deliberateness that felt important, necessary. The pilot light died immediately, the tube's glow fading over several seconds, and the basement temperature began its slow climb back to ambient. I went upstairs and didn't return to the basement for 3 days. But on the 4th night, I played the set list again. All 9 songs in order, ending with Aguas de Março. No 10th track, no encore, no experiments. The twin powered on for song 1, stayed warm through all 9 albums, and clicked off the moment the needle lifted from the final groove. The ritual was complete. The performance was finished. And I had no idea if I'd been communing with my father's ghost, experiencing some elaborate electromagnetic anomaly, or slowly losing my grip on consensus reality. The only thing I knew for certain was that tomorrow night, around midnight, I'd go back downstairs and play the set list again. And the night after that, and the night after that, for as long as the amplifier kept responding, for as long as the ritual held meaning or I held sanity, whichever lasted longer. Because that's what set lists are for, to be played again and again, each performance identical to the last, each repetition a small victory against the silence that eventually claims all music. The basement waits below me now, its concrete floor cool and patient, its amplifiers dark and ready. In a few hours, I'll descend the stairs with the first album, drop the needle into the opening groove, and watch the twin reverb wake like it always does, like it always will, until the pattern breaks, or I do. And somewhere in the space between those glowing tubes and my desperate attention, something persists. Call it memory, call it love, call it the electromagnetic echo of a man who couldn't quite let go of his last set list. I just wish I knew which of us was the ghost. Story 8. The fluorescent lights in the underground passage between the red and blue lines always flickered at 6:47 p.m. I knew because I checked my phone the first time it happened. That instinctive need to anchor myself in something concrete when the world stutters. The tiles along the curved wall were that particular shade of institutional beige that absorbs light instead of reflecting it, and someone decades ago had attempted to brighten the space with a mosaic, abstract shapes in burnt orange and brown that might have been cheerful in 1972, but now just looked like dried blood. I'd been taking this route home from the advertising agency for 8 months when I first saw him. It was a Thursday in February, one of those Chicago evenings when the cold follows you underground and settles into your bones. The passage was nearly empty, just the echo of footsteps from somewhere ahead, and the distant rumble of trains moving through the earth. I was thinking about the Henderson account, about whether the tagline I'd pitched that afternoon was clever or just desperate, when I felt it. That specific pressure of being watched that makes the back of your neck tighten. He stood against the mosaic, maybe 30 feet ahead where the passage curved. A man in a plaid coverall, the industrial kind that mechanics wear, with a dark boina tilted on his head. His right arm hung at his side, fingers relaxed. His left shoulder ended in a flat line where the fabric was pinned back. What struck me most wasn't the missing arm. It was how he looked at me. Not the blank stare of someone waiting for a train, or the quick assessment of a stranger in a public space. He looked at me the way you look at someone you recognize, someone you've been expecting. His eyes held mine with an intensity that felt almost intimate, as if we shared some understanding I couldn't quite remember. I glanced away, focusing on the exit sign above the stairs to the Blue Line platform. My heart was doing something irregular, that flutter you get when your body processes danger before your mind catches up. When I looked back, maybe 3 seconds later, the space where he'd stood was empty. No sound of footsteps receding, no motion in my peripheral vision. Just gone. I told myself I'd imagined the intensity of his stare, that he'd simply walked around the curve while I wasn't looking, that the strange lighting and my own fatigue had created something unsettling from nothing. The mind does that, I knew. It fills in gaps, creates patterns, finds faces in random noise. But I could still feel where his eyes had touched me. March brought rain that turned to sleet, and the underground passages became a refuge from the violence of the weather above. I'd almost forgotten about the man in the coveralls when I saw him again. Same spot, same tilt to his head, same single arm hanging loose while the other shoulder remained a flat absence. This time I noticed details I'd missed before. The coveralls were clean, pressed even, as if he'd just put them on. The boina was pulled low enough to shadow his eyes, but I could still feel their focus. There was something in the way he leaned against the mosaic, a casual posture that suggested he'd been waiting, that he had all the time in the world. I stopped walking. Around me, the usual evening commuters flowed past, briefcases and umbrellas and the shuffle of tired feet. No one else seemed to notice him. No one else slowed or stared or showed any reaction to the man who stood perfectly still in the center of the corridor, watching me with that terrible recognition. My phone buzzed. I looked down at the screen. A message from Tyler about tomorrow's client meeting. And when I looked up again, the man was gone. This time I was certain. I'd looked away for less than 2 seconds, and the physics of it didn't work. He couldn't have moved out of sight that quickly, not without running, not without someone noticing. I walked to where he'd been standing. The tiles were dry, no footprints in the slush that commuters tracked in from above. I put my hand against the mosaic, feeling the slight texture of the tiles, the coolness of the ceramic. Real. Solid. But my hand was shaking. The third time was in April, and I'd been dreading it without admitting to myself that I was dreading it. Some part of me had been bracing for it, waiting for that moment when I'd round the corner and see him there again. I'd started taking different routes home, catching the red line 2 stops earlier, transferring at different stations, anything to avoid that particular passage. But it added 20 minutes to my commute, and the client presentations were getting more demanding, and my exhaustion eventually outweighed my unease. He was there on a Tuesday evening, and this time I noticed he was standing exactly where the corridor curved most sharply, where the ceiling dipped slightly lower and the lights were dimmest. His missing arm seemed more pronounced somehow, the pinned fabric stark against his body, but it was his face that stopped me cold. I could see it clearly now beneath the boina, middle-aged, weathered, with lines around the eyes that could have been from squinting at machinery or from years of exposure to wind and sun. Not threatening, exactly, not even particularly unusual, but looking at me with an expression of profound sadness, as if he knew something about me that I didn't know about myself, as if he was sorry for what I was going to discover. The rational part of my mind, the part that wrote copy and analyzed focus groups and understood the mechanics of persuasion, started cataloging explanations. A homeless man who'd found shelter in the tunnels, someone with a mental illness who'd fixated on this particular spot. A coincidence repeated just enough times to seem like a pattern. The mind creates narratives, I told myself. It finds meaning in randomness because randomness is unbearable. But my body wasn't listening to the rational part of my mind. My body was screaming that something was wrong, that I needed to run, that this place and this man were connected to something I didn't want to understand. I forced myself to walk forward. If he was real, he was just a man. If he wasn't real, then I needed to know that too. I needed to get close enough to prove to myself what he was. 10 feet away, I could see the texture of his coveralls, the pattern of the plaid, the way his one hand curled slightly at his side. 5 feet away, I could see the stubble on his jaw, the exact shade of gray in his eyes. 3 feet away, I could smell motor oil and something metallic and old. I reached out toward him, my hand moving of its own accord, and he smiled. Not a friendly smile, a knowing smile. A smile that said we'd done this before, that we'd do it again, that it didn't matter what I understood or didn't understand, because the pattern was already set. Then I was past him, my hand grasping empty air, and when I spun around, he was gone. But this time I heard something, not footsteps, a sound like metal scraping against concrete, rhythmic and distant, coming from somewhere deeper in the tunnels. I did what any reasonable person would do. I asked around. At the agency, during lunch, I mentioned the tunnels to Tyler. Casual, just commenting on the commute, the strange lighting, how disorienting the underground could be. Tyler got a weird look on his face, the kind of expression people get when they're deciding whether to say something or pretend they didn't hear the question. Finally, he leaned in, lowering his voice even though we were alone in the break room. He told me about a man he'd seen years ago, back when he'd first moved to Chicago and worked at a different firm. Same tunnel, same time of evening. A man in work clothes with only one arm, standing against the wall, watching. Tyler had seen him 3 times over the course of a month, and each time the man had vanished the moment Tyler looked away. He'd thought he was losing his mind, had almost gone to see someone about it, but then he'd changed jobs and didn't use that station anymore, and eventually convinced himself it had been stress, fatigue, the isolation of a new city playing tricks on him. But the way Tyler looked at me when he finished the story, I knew he'd never really convinced himself of anything. He'd just stopped thinking about it because thinking about it was worse than not knowing. I thanked him and changed the subject, but something had shifted. It wasn't just me. It wasn't just in my head. Or if it was in my head, it was in other heads too. And that somehow made it worse. The building above the tunnel was one of those Chicago structures that had been built in the 1920s and forgotten by everyone except the people who had to work there. 6 stories of limestone and narrow windows, housing offices for accountants and immigration lawyers, and a dental practice that always smelled like clove oil. I'd passed it 1,000 times without really seeing it. The woman who cleaned the building was there most evenings when I walked by, usually smoking a cigarette by the service entrance, her cart of supplies visible through the propped open door. I'd nodded to her occasionally, exchanged the kind of minimal pleasantries that urban life requires. I didn't know her name, but I needed to know. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't crazy, or better yet, to tell me I was crazy and explain it in a way that would make the knot in my chest loosen. I found her on a Wednesday evening just finishing her shift. She was older than I'd thought, maybe 60, with the kind of face that has seen enough to not be surprised by much. I asked her about the tunnel below the building, about the passage between the lines, trying to sound casual and academic, as if I was just curious about the history of the station. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in her expression. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. She knew about the man, she said. Everyone who worked in the building knew about him, though nobody talked about it much. They called him the tool man, though she didn't know why. He'd been there for as long as she'd been cleaning the building, and the woman she'd replaced had mentioned him too. In that offhand way, people mention things that make them uncomfortable, but that they've learned to live with. He liked to stand where the old escalator used to be, she said. The one they'd shut down in the 80s, too expensive to maintain. Cheaper to just brick over the entrance and make people take the stairs. But you could still see the outline if you knew where to look. The way the tiles didn't quite match where they'd patched the floor. I asked her if she'd ever seen him herself. She shook her head. She didn't use that passage, she said. She took the bus. But she'd heard the sounds sometimes, late at night when she was finishing the top floor. Mechanical sounds like gears grinding or metal hitting metal, coming up through the vents from somewhere below. Tools, she thought. The sound of someone working with tools. She stubbed out her cigarette and picked up her cart. Before she went inside, she turned back to me. There was something sad in her eyes, something that reminded me of how the toolman had looked at me that last time. People who keep seeing him, she said, they usually figure out why eventually. Most people just catch a glimpse once and forget about it. But the ones who keep seeing him, the ones he keeps watching, there's always a reason. She didn't know what the reason was, she said. She just knew there was one. Then she was gone, and I was standing alone on the sidewalk as evening settled into full dark, and I realized I'd been hoping she would tell me it was nothing, that I was imagining things, that there was a rational explanation. Instead, she'd confirmed that the toolman was real, or at least real enough that multiple people across decades had seen him, had been watched by him, had tried to forget him. And she'd suggested that he chose who saw him, that there was intention behind it, purpose. I started researching. Late at night, unable to sleep, I searched through Chicago history archives, old newspaper databases, anything I could find about the station, the tunnel, the building above. I learned that the escalator had been installed in 1964 and decommissioned in 1983 after a malfunction that had injured several people. I learned that the tunnel itself had been built in the 1940s, part of the massive expansion of the city's transit system. I learned that the building above had once housed a machinery supply company back in the 30s, before it was converted to offices. But I found no mention of any one-armed man, no accidents involving workers, no mysterious deaths, no local legends or ghost stories that matched what I'd seen. It was as if the toolman existed in some space between documented history and collective forgetting, real enough to be seen but not real enough to leave a trace. The logical explanation, that he was just a homeless man with a peculiar fixation on that spot, that my stress and Tyler's story had created a mythology out of nothing, was still available to me. I could have chosen to believe that. I should have chosen to believe that. But I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me, the recognition, the sadness, as if he knew something about me that I was about to learn. I stopped using that passage entirely. I rerouted my entire commute, added 40 minutes to my day, just to avoid walking through that tunnel. At work, I threw myself into projects, stayed late, volunteered for the accounts no one else wanted. Anything to not think about the tool man, about what it meant that Tyler had seen him years ago, about what the cleaning woman had said about people who kept seeing him. But avoidance has a way of making things worse. The more I tried not to think about it, the more it consumed me. I started seeing coveralls everywhere, construction workers on the street, maintenance crews in the office building, even a random guy in a hardware store who had both arms but somehow made me freeze in the checkout line. I'd catch myself checking over my shoulder, watching for someone watching me, feeling that pressure on the back of my neck even in crowded spaces where it made no sense. Tyler noticed. He caught me one afternoon staring at nothing, or at something no one else could see, and he pulled me aside. He asked if I was okay, if I'd seen the man again, and when I told him I'd been avoiding the tunnel entirely, he nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he'd suspected. He told me about the month after his last sighting, how he'd felt like he was unraveling, how he'd started questioning everything about his perception and his sanity. He'd gone to therapy eventually, talked around the edges of it without ever saying what he'd really seen, and the therapist had suggested stress management and better sleep hygiene, and maybe a low dose of something to take the edge off. It had helped, he said, not because it made the toolman less real, but because it made his fear of the toolman more manageable. But then he said something that made my blood go cold. He said that sometimes, even now, 7 years later, he'd be walking through a different station or a parking garage or anywhere with that particular quality of artificial light and empty space, and he'd feel it, that presence, that sensation of being recognized by something that shouldn't know him. It never lasted long, just a moment of certainty that if he turned around, he'd see the man in the coveralls watching him with that sad, knowing expression. It hadn't ended, Tyler meant. It had just paused. 3 weeks after I'd last used the tunnel, I found myself there again. I hadn't planned it. I'd stayed late at the office working on a pitch deck, and by the time I finished, it was past 8. The alternative route would have taken an hour, and I was exhausted. And some part of me, the part that was tired of being afraid, tired of letting my life be rearranged by something I couldn't even prove was real, made the decision to just take the direct path home. The tunnel was nearly empty at that hour. A few scattered commuters, everyone moving quickly, no one making eye contact. The fluorescent lights flickered in their familiar rhythm. The mosaic looked darker than I remembered, the burnt orange shapes seeming to shift and pulse at the edge of my vision. I walked quickly, not running but not dawdling, my eyes fixed on the exit sign ahead. I told myself I'd just walk through, get to the other side, prove to myself that there was nothing to be afraid of, that the toolman was just a coincidence, just a homeless man who happened to match a description Tyler had given me, that my mind had turned into something supernatural through repetition and fear. But halfway through the passage, right where the curve was sharpest, I felt it again. That pressure, that certainty of being watched. I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to keep walking, to get out of the tunnel, to not engage with whatever was about to happen. But my head turned anyway, pulled by something stronger than survival instinct, some deep need to know even when knowing was dangerous. He was there, closer than he'd ever been before. Not against the wall this time, but standing in the center of the passage, directly in my path, the single arm at his side, the boina shadowing his face. But this time I could see his expression clearly, and what I saw there wasn't menace or malice. It was pity. He raised his one hand slowly, pointing past me toward the way I'd come. His lips moved, but no sound came out, or if it did, it was swallowed by the sudden roar of a train passing somewhere above or below, the vibration making the tiles hum against my feet. I turned to look where he pointed. The passage behind me was empty, just tiles and lights and the distant sound of footsteps echoing from somewhere else in the station. When I turned back, he was gone, but the space where he'd stood felt different somehow, charged with an energy that made my hair stand up. And then I understood. Not everything. Not the mechanics of it or the why of it or whether he was ghost or hallucination or something else entirely. But I understood that he wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to warn me. I started walking again, faster now, my heart hammering, and that's when I heard it. The sound the cleaning woman had described, metal on metal, rhythmic and grinding, coming from somewhere below my feet. The sound of machinery, of tools, of something working away in the darkness beneath the tiles. The sound of the old escalator, maybe. The one that had been shut down 40 years ago. The one that shouldn't be moving. I ran then, properly ran, my footsteps echoing off the walls. And I could have sworn I heard other footsteps too, keeping pace with mine or maybe ahead of me, always just out of sight around the next curve. I burst through onto the Blue Line platform, gasping for air, and the handful of people waiting for the train looked at me like I was crazy. And maybe I was. But as I stood there, trying to calm my breathing, trying to slow my heart rate, I caught my reflection in the window of the station agent's booth. And behind my reflection, barely visible in the dark glass, I could see the entrance to the passage I'd just left. There was a figure standing there, not the tool man, someone else, someone in a business suit, carrying a briefcase, about to walk through the tunnel for their evening commute. Someone who looked, in posture and gait, and the distracted expression of someone thinking about work, exactly like me. I spun around, but the passage entrance was empty. When I looked back at the glass, my reflection was alone. I don't use that tunnel anymore. I don't think I ever will again. But I find myself thinking about the tool man constantly, trying to piece together what he was trying to tell me, what I was supposed to understand from that moment when he pointed back the way I'd come. Tyler doesn't work at the agency anymore. He left 3 weeks after our conversation, took a job in Minneapolis. And when I asked him if everything was okay, he just said he needed a change. But I saw his expression when he told me, and I knew. I knew that he'd seen something or felt something or understood something that made staying in Chicago impossible. The cleaning woman still works in the building above the tunnel. I see her sometimes, smoking by the service entrance, and we nod to each other but don't speak. There's nothing left to say. She told me what she knew, and it was both more and less than I wanted to hear. I've started noticing things, though. Small things that might be nothing or might be everything. The way I sometimes lose track of time on my commute, arriving home without remembering the journey. The way my reflection in windows and mirrors sometimes seems to move a fraction of a second after I do, as if it's copying me rather than matching me. The way I occasionally catch myself standing in places I don't remember walking to, facing directions I don't remember choosing. And late at night, when the city is quiet and I'm alone in my apartment, I sometimes hear it. Distant but distinct. The sound of metal on metal, rhythmic and grinding. The sound of tools working. The sound of machinery that shouldn't be moving. The sound coming from inside my walls. I tell myself it's the building's pipes, the heating system, the normal sounds of an old structure settling and creaking. I tell myself that the toolman was just a homeless man, that Tyler's story planted a seed in my mind that grew into something more through repetition and fear, that the cleaning woman was just repeating urban legends she'd heard from other cleaners. I tell myself all of this, and sometimes, in the daylight, I almost believe it. But then night comes, and I hear the sounds, and I think about the way the toolman looked at me with such profound sadness, about how he pointed back the way I'd come, as if trying to show me something I'd missed, something I'd walked past without noticing, about how I saw someone who looked exactly like me in the reflection, about to walk through the tunnel. And I wonder if the reason some people keep seeing the toolman isn't because he's choosing to show himself to them, but because they're the ones who are already gone, the ones who never made it through the tunnel, the ones who are still down there somewhere in the darkness, walking the same passage over and over thinking they're heading home. I wonder if the toolman stands there and watches because he's the only one who remembers, the only one who knows what happened in that moment when someone looked away, when the lights flickered, when the old escalator that shouldn't be moving started up again. I wonder if he keeps trying to warn us, the ones who can still see him, but we never understand until it's too late. I wonder if I'm already down there in that tunnel, walking in circles, and everything I think is happening now, my apartment, my job, my life, is just the story I'm telling myself while my body stands against the mosaic tiles, missing an arm, wearing a boina and coveralls, watching the next person who looks like they might be able to see me, waiting to warn them, knowing they won't understand. The sound of metal scraping metal is getting louder. The rhythm is familiar now. It matches my heartbeat, and I can't remember the last time I actually saw my reflection move at the exact same time I did. Story 9. The overhead lights in the service corridor flickered twice before settling into their usual sterile hum. I'd walked this hallway so many times during the 4-day medical conference that I could navigate it with my eyes closed. Past the storage room with the broken lock, around the corner where the carpet changed from burgundy to navy, straight to the service elevator that reeked of industrial cleaner and something vaguely organic I tried not to think about. That's why, when I saw the alcove on the third night, my first thought wasn't surprise but exhaustion. The kind of bone-deep weariness that makes you see things that aren't quite there, shadows that move wrong, patterns in the wallpaper that seem to breathe. The alcove sat between the storage room and the corner, where I would have sworn there was only wall. A small recess, maybe 6 feet deep, bathed in a yellowish light that seemed to originate from no particular source. Inside, 2 vending machines, one for snacks and one for drinks, both humming with an electrical drone that felt too loud for the space. Between them, a stainless steel sink with a single faucet, the kind you'd find in a janitor's closet. Above the sink, mounted on the wall, a square analog clock with a black frame and white face, 2:46. The second hand didn't move. I stood there in the corridor, my camera bag digging into my shoulder, and tried to remember if I'd ever noticed this space before. Surely I had. 4 days of photographing keynote speakers, breakout sessions, networking events. I'd made this walk at least a dozen times. The hotel wasn't that large, the service corridor wasn't that long, but the alcove felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The light was too warm, too golden, like sunset in a place that should only know fluorescent white. The vending machines were older models, the kind with pull handles instead of keypads, their glass fronts slightly fogged as if they'd been running cold for decades. The sink gleamed with a dull patina that suggested both age and meticulous cleaning. My reflection stared back at me from the curved surface of the faucet, stretched and distorted, my face too long, my eyes too far apart. I looked away. The conference had run late. Another dinner I'd photographed from the edges of the ballroom, another keynote that went over time, another round of networking drinks where I stood behind my camera and watched people pretend to be interested in each other's business cards. My feet ached. My back ached. The 3 ibuprofen I'd taken 2 hours ago had worn off, leaving behind the familiar throb behind my eyes that signaled a migraine building in the wings. I needed water, or caffeine, or both. The vending machine hummed louder as I approached, as if sensing my presence. The selection was standard: Coke, Sprite, bottled water, energy drinks I'd never heard of, but the prices seemed wrong. Too low, 75 cents for a can of soda. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen that price outside of a gas station in the middle of nowhere. I fed 3 quarters into the slot. They fell with a satisfying clunk that echoed in the small space. I pulled the handle for a Coke. The can tumbled forward, landing in the collection bin with a metallic thud that seemed to reverberate longer than it should have. The can was cold enough to hurt my palm. Condensation formed immediately, running down my fingers in icy rivulets. I popped the tab and took a long drink, the carbonation sharp and almost painful against the back of my throat. The taste was right, but somehow off, like a copy of a copy, all the notes there but the resonance missing. I glanced at the clock again. Still 2:46. The second hand remained frozen between the 9 and the 10, as if time itself had gotten stuck trying to push forward. The minute hand pointed straight down. The hour hand leaned slightly past the 2. Something about that bothered me more than it should have. I set the Coke on the edge of the sink and turned on the faucet. Water rushed out in a single clear stream, cold enough to make my fingers tingle. I splashed some on my face, letting the shock of it wake me up, drive away some of the fog that had settled over my thoughts. When I looked up, my reflection in the faucet was still wrong, still stretched and alien, my features rearranged into something that was almost me but not quite. Behind my reflection, in the curved metal surface, I could see the vending machines, and behind them, the corridor. And in the corridor, barely visible in the distorted image, a figure stood watching. I spun around. Empty hallway. Burgundy carpet stretching in both directions. Overhead lights humming their electrical song. The storage room door closed, the corner visible in the distance. Everything exactly as it should be. I turned back to the sink. In the reflection, the corridor was empty. My hands were shaking when I picked up the Coke. I told myself it was the cold water, the late hour, the exhaustion that made everything feel slightly unreal. I'd been working 16-hour days for 4 days straight, living on coffee and conference food, and 3 hours of sleep a night. Of course I was seeing things. Of course my nerves were fried. The alcove suddenly felt smaller, the walls closer than they'd been a moment ago. The light seemed dimmer, more sickly, casting shadows that pooled in the corners like dark water. The vending machines hummed louder, their vibration traveling up through the floor and into my bones. I needed to leave. I grabbed my camera bag and walked out of the alcove, not looking back, not letting myself check whether the figure in the reflection had returned. The corridor felt longer than usual, the corner farther away, as if the space itself had stretched when I wasn't paying attention. My footsteps sounded wrong on the carpet, too loud, with an echo that shouldn't exist in a carpeted hallway. When I reached my room, I locked the door, set the Coke on the nightstand, and fell onto the bed without bothering to undress. Sleep came quickly, dreamless and heavy, the kind of unconsciousness that feels less like rest and more like erasure. The final day of the conference started like all the others. Morning keynote at 8, breakfast spread in the mezzanine, networking session in conference room B. I moved through it all on autopilot, my camera an extension of my hand, capturing smiles and handshakes and PowerPoint presentations without really seeing any of it. By noon, I'd almost convinced myself the alcove had been a hallucination, a product of exhaustion and poor lighting, and the particular kind of disorientation that comes from spending too much time in a hotel, where every corridor looks the same, and every day blends into the next. The human brain does strange things when it's tired. It fills in gaps, creates patterns, sees meaning in randomness. I had a break between the lunch session and the afternoon workshops. I needed to refill my water bottle, check my equipment, maybe grab something from the vending machine in the service corridor. The thought stopped me mid-step. I'd been planning to go to the service corridor, the one I'd walked a dozen times, the one I knew like the back of my hand. Except now I couldn't quite remember what was supposed to be there. I stood in the empty hallway outside the conference rooms, my camera bag heavy on my shoulder, and tried to picture the corridor. Storage room, check. Carpet transition, check. Service elevator, check. And between the storage room and the corner, there was wall, just wall. Cream-colored paint, maybe a fire extinguisher in a glass case, possibly a print of some generic landscape, but mostly just wall. No alcove, no vending machines, no sink with a frozen clock above it. The certainty hit me like cold water. I'd been to that corridor yesterday, the day before that. There had never been an alcove. It was impossible. Hotels don't just sprout new rooms overnight. Architecture doesn't rearrange itself while you sleep. But I could still taste the Coke, still feel the cold of the can in my palm. And when I checked my wallet, there was a receipt tucked behind my credit cards, time-stamped $2.46 for a 75-cent purchase at a vending machine that didn't exist. I found myself walking toward the service corridor without consciously deciding to move. My feet knew the way, carrying me past the conference rooms, past the elevators, past the point where guests were supposed to go. The staff-only sign on the door barely registered. I pushed through, into the familiar space with its industrial carpet and fluorescent lights and smell of cleaning solution. Storage room, carpet transition, and beyond that, the corner, and beyond that, the service elevator. Just wall, cream-colored paint, a fire extinguisher in a glass case, a framed print of a desert landscape, all browns and tans and empty sky. No alcove. I stood there for a long time, staring at the wall, trying to find some seam or discontinuity that would prove I hadn't imagined it. The paint was smooth, unmarked, the color consistent with the rest of the corridor. There was no indication that anything had ever been different. I pressed my palm against the wall. Solid. Cold. Real. The receipt in my wallet felt like it was burning. I pulled it out, unfolded it. The paper was thin, thermal printed, the kind that fades over time. The text was barely visible, the ink already graying at the edges. Sierra Hotel vending machine. Number 3, 1 Coca-Cola, classic $0, 0.75 time, 246. Thank you for your purchase. Sierra Hotel. That was this hotel, Sierra Reno officially, but everyone called it Sierra Hotel because of the old neon sign on the roof that had lost 2 letters in a windstorm years ago and never been repaired. I looked at the wall again, ran my hand across it, feeling for hidden doors, panels, any sign that the space could open up. Nothing, just wall. My camera bag shifted on my shoulder, and I remembered the Coke can. I'd left it on the nightstand in my room, too groggy to throw it away before I left this morning. Physical evidence. Proof that something had happened, that I hadn't just hallucinated the entire encounter. I needed to see it again. The elevator ride to my floor felt endless, the numbers changing too slowly, the hotel's Muzak version of a song I almost recognized playing too loud in the confined space. When the doors finally opened, I practically ran down the corridor to my room, fumbling with the keycard, my hands shaking as I pushed inside. The nightstand was empty. I stood in the doorway, staring at the bare surface where the Coke can should have been. Had I thrown it away? Maybe I'd done it without thinking, muscle memory taking over while my conscious mind was still foggy with sleep. The trash can sat by the desk, and I crossed the room, looked inside. Empty bag, not even a tissue or a gum wrapper. Housekeeping must have come through already. That was it. They'd emptied the trash, taken the can, made the bed that I'd barely disturbed in my exhausted sleep. Standard service. Nothing strange about it. Except the bed wasn't made. The sheets were still rumpled from where I'd collapsed on top of them, still held the impression of my body. The towels in the bathroom were still damp from my morning shower. Housekeeping hadn't been here yet. I checked the trash can again, as if the can might materialize if I looked hard enough. Still empty. I checked under the bed, behind the nightstand, in the bathroom, anywhere it might have rolled or fallen. Nothing. The can had vanished as completely as the alcove. I sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out the receipt again. It was fading faster now, the text barely visible, like something printed a year ago instead of hours. I held it up to the light, trying to make out the details, and that's when I noticed the small print at the bottom. Machine serviced by Timekeeper Vending Co. St. 1946. The receipt was time-stamped 2:46. The clock in the alcove had been stopped at 2:46. A pattern, my exhausted brain whispered. A connection that meant something, if only I could figure out what. I needed to talk to someone. The front desk, maybe, or maintenance. Someone who would know about vending machines in the service corridor, about rooms that appeared and disappeared, about clocks that stopped at specific times. But even as I thought it, I knew how it would sound. I knew the look I'd get, the careful tone people use when they're worried you might be losing your grip on reality. Sir, are you feeling all right? Have you been getting enough sleep? The conference has been stressful, hasn't it? Maybe you should lie down for a bit. And maybe they'd be right. I'd been working too hard, sleeping too little, pushing my body past its limits. Hallucinations weren't uncommon in extreme exhaustion. The brain started filling in gaps, creating sensory experiences that felt real but weren't. I'd read about it, heard stories from other photographers who'd worked around the clock and started seeing things in the corners of their vision. But the receipt was real. I could feel it between my fingers, see the fading text, the date and time and purchase amount. Unless I'd gotten it somewhere else, some other vending machine in some other corridor, and my tired brain had constructed an entire false memory around it. The thought made my stomach turn. I looked at my camera. 4 days of photos, hundreds of images documenting every moment of the conference. If I'd walked past that alcove before, if it had been there all along, surely I would have noticed it. Surely my eye, trained to see details and composition and the way light fell on surfaces, would have registered an anomaly like that. I pulled up the photos from the previous days, scrolling through them, looking for any image that might show the corridor. Most were from the conference rooms, the ballroom, the mezzanine, But there, near the end of the second day's shoot, a candid of two attendees talking in the hallway, and behind them, visible in the background, the service corridor entrance. I zoomed in, my hand trembling as I expanded the image, trying to see past the two men in the foreground to the corridor beyond. The resolution was good, professional grade, every detail sharp and clear. Storage room, carpet transition, wall, just wall, no alcove, no vending machines, nothing but cream-colored paint and a fire extinguisher in a glass case. The photo was time-stamped 8:47 p.m., exactly 2 days before I'd found the alcove, or thought I'd found it, or hallucinated it into existence. I scrolled forward, looking for any other images that might show that section of corridor. There was one from yesterday morning, a shot of the conference schedule board near the entrance to the service area, and there, at the edge of the frame, just barely visible, the wall where the alcove should have been, as if I had any right to expect it to be there. But when I zoomed in, when I looked at that sliver of corridor visible in the corner of the image, something was different. The paint looked darker, somehow, or maybe just shadowed. And there, at the very edge, almost cut off by the frame, was that a corner, an indent in the wall? I couldn't tell. The image was too cropped, the angle too sharp. It could have been nothing. A trick of the light, a shadow, a flaw in the sensor, or it could have been the beginning of an alcove that wasn't there when I took the photo. I didn't go back to the conference that afternoon. I told myself I needed a break, needed to rest, needed to let my mind clear before the final evening's events. But really, I couldn't stop thinking about the alcove, about the receipt that was now so faded I could barely read it, about the Coke can that had vanished from my nightstand, about the clock frozen at 2:46, and the vending machine serviced by a company established in 1946, and the pattern that connected them all like a thread through time. I walked the service corridor 3 more times that afternoon. Morning light, afternoon light, the long shadows of late day. I measured the distance between the storage room and the corner, counted my steps, took photos from every angle. I pressed my ear against the wall and listened for the hum of vending machines, the electrical drone that had been almost painful in its insistence. Nothing. Just wall. Just silence. But each time I turned away, each time I forced myself to walk back toward the main hotel, I felt a pull. Not physical exactly. More like a knowing. A certainty that if I just turned around at the right moment, if I caught the corridor at the right time, the alcove would be there, waiting. The thought should have frightened me. Instead, it felt inevitable. Like something that had always been going to happen, written into the architecture of the building and the pattern of my life, a convergence point I'd been walking toward for longer than I realized. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed and watched the digital clock on the nightstand tick through the hours. 1:15, 1:43, 2:12. Each minute felt like an eternity. Each change of the numbers a small shock that jolted me further from any hope of rest. At 2:30, I gave up. I got dressed in the dark, grabbed my camera bag, and headed for the service corridor. The hotel was silent in the way only hotels can be in the dead hours of the night. The hum of the air conditioning, the distant rumble of the ice machine, the creak of the building settling. All of it felt too loud in the stillness, every sound amplified and distorted by the emptiness. The service corridor was darker than usual. Some of the overhead lights were off, either on a timer or burned out and not yet replaced. The pools of illumination from the remaining fixtures seemed inadequate, leaving long stretches of shadow between them. I walked slowly, my footsteps muffled by the carpet, past the conference rooms, now silent and locked, past the elevators, their buttons glowing softly in the darkness, past the staff-only door, which swung open with barely a sound. The corridor stretched ahead of me, longer than it should be, the end lost in shadows. Storage room on my left, carpet transition under my feet, and there, between the storage room and the corner, the alcove. It was exactly as I remembered. The warm yellow light, too golden for the space, the 2 vending machines humming their electrical song, the stainless steel sink with its distorted reflection. The clock on the wall, frozen at 2:46. I checked my watch. 2:43, 3 minutes. I had 3 minutes before the time would match, before whatever pattern or convergence or cosmic joke was playing itself out would complete. I stepped into the alcove. The temperature dropped immediately, the air cold enough to make me shiver despite my jacket. The light seemed to wrap around me, thick and syrupy, moving slower than light should move. The vending machines were louder now, their hum resonating in my chest, making my teeth ache with the vibration. I approached the sink. My reflection stared back at me from the faucet, stretched and wrong, my face too long, my eyes too far apart. But this time, I didn't look away. I stared at the distorted image, trying to see what it was trying to show me. Behind my reflection, the vending machines. Behind them, the corridor. And in the corridor, the figure was back. Tall, indistinct, standing in the shadows at the edge of the alcove's light. Watching. I spun around. Empty space. Just the corridor, dark and silent. When I looked back at the reflection, the figure was gone. My watch read 2:45. 1 minute. The humming of the vending machines was almost unbearable now, a frequency that felt like it was pulling at something deep inside me, unraveling threads I didn't know I had. The light pulsed. Or maybe that was just my vision, my exhausted brain finally giving up the fight against whatever was happening. I looked at the clock on the wall, still 2:46. The second hand still frozen between the 9 and the 10, time stuck in amber, refusing to move forward or back. And then, as my watch ticked over to 2:46, the second hand moved. One tick, clean and precise. The soft click of mechanism engaging, gears turning, time resuming its march. And with that single tick, everything changed. The light dimmed, went from golden to sickly green. The hum of the vending machines dropped in pitch, became something almost like words, a language just below the threshold of comprehension. The air grew colder still, cold enough that my breath came out in visible clouds. In the reflection of the faucet, I saw the figure again. But this time, when I turned around, it was still there, standing in the corridor, tall and thin and somehow wrong, its proportions not quite human, its edges blurred as if it couldn't quite hold itself together in 3 dimensions. It didn't have a face exactly, just a suggestion of features, holes where eyes should be, a darker smudge that might have been a mouth. It didn't move, just stood there, watching me with those non-eyes, its presence somehow both a question and an answer. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and sprint back down the corridor, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever that thing was. But I couldn't move. My legs wouldn't respond. My body frozen in place as completely as the clock had been frozen at 2:46. The figure raised one hand, or what passed for a hand, a collection of 2 long fingers that moved independently, each one curling and uncurling in a rhythm that made my stomach turn. It pointed at me, then at the clock, then back at me. Time, it seemed to be saying. You're out of time. Or maybe, you've always been out of time. Or maybe, time is a loop and you're caught in it, walking the same corridor over and over, finding the same alcove at the same moment, drinking the same Coke and seeing the same reflection, and meeting the same figure that isn't a figure, that never was, that always will be. My watch read 2:47. The clock on the wall still read 2:46. The second hand had stopped again, frozen in its endless moment, refusing to acknowledge that time had moved forward. Or maybe I was the one out of sync, living 1 minute ahead or 1 minute behind, caught in a gap that shouldn't exist but somehow did. The figure took a step forward, then another, moving with a smoothness that wasn't quite like walking, more like gliding, like it existed slightly above the floor rather than on it. It crossed the threshold of the alcove, and the temperature dropped even further, cold enough that frost began to form on the edges of the sink, on the glass fronts of the vending machines. It stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I should have been able to feel its breath, if it had breath. close enough that I could see the way reality seemed to warp around it, space bending and twisting, the corridor behind it stretching and contracting like something alive. And then it reached out and touched my chest, not physically, not exactly. Its fingers passed through my jacket, through my shirt, through skin and muscle and bone, reaching into some space inside me that I didn't know existed. I felt it pull, gently but insistently, tugging at something fundamental and unmovable. Time, I realized. It was pulling at my time, the minutes and hours and days that made up my existence, the thread of moments that connected past to present to future. It was unspooling me, unmaking me, pulling me apart second by second. And the worst part was that it felt familiar. Like coming home. Like returning to a place I'd been before and would be again, over and over, in an endless loop that spiraled through the alcove and the corridor and the hotel, forever and always, trapped at 246. Then it let go. I stumbled backward, gasping, my hand clutching at my chest even though there was no wound, no mark, no sign that anything had happened. The figure retreated, gliding back across the threshold, back into the shadows of the corridor. It raised its hand again, not pointing this time but waving, a gesture that could have been goodbye or see you soon, or you can't leave. You never could. The alcove's light flickered, once, twice, and went out. When it came back on, I was alone. The corridor was empty. The vending machines hummed their usual hum. Nothing ominous about it now, just the electrical drone of refrigeration units doing their job. The sink was just a sink, my reflection normal in the polished faucet. The clock read 2:46. The second hand was moving, ticking off seconds in a steady, reassuring rhythm. My watch read 2:48. I was 2 minutes ahead, or the clock was 2 minutes behind, or time itself had folded in on itself, created a pocket, a loop, a space where past and present overlapped, and neither was quite real. I walked out of the alcove on shaking legs. The corridor seemed normal now, the right length, the shadows falling where they should. I made it to the elevators, pressed the call button, waited in the soft glow of the indicator lights. The doors opened. I stepped inside, pressed the button for my floor. As the elevator began to rise, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirrored wall. Tired eyes, pale skin, the signs of 4 days with too little sleep and too much stress. But something else too. Something around the edges, a slight blur or distortion, as if I wasn't quite in focus, wasn't quite fully present in this moment or this place. I looked away. The conference ended the next morning. I packed my equipment, checked out, and loaded my car in the bright Nevada sunlight. The hotel looked normal in daylight, mundane even, just another mid-range property in a city full of them. The service corridor was probably just a service corridor, nothing more mysterious than housekeeping carts and employee break rooms. I drove out of the parking lot without looking back, but the receipt is still in my wallet, the text now so faded it's barely visible, like something printed decades ago instead of days. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself looking at clocks, watching for the moment when they hit 2:46, wondering if that's when the alcove appears in other hotels, other corridors, waiting for other exhausted travelers who walk the same path at the same time and see what they shouldn't see. I still have the Coke can too. Found it in my car 2 days after I left Reno, rolling around in the back seat where I definitely didn't put it. It's dented, the aluminum creased as if something grabbed it too hard, as if something tried to hold onto physical proof of an encounter that maybe didn't happen, maybe never could happen, maybe always happens at exactly 2:46. The hotel doesn't sell that brand of Coke. I checked their website, called the front desk, even asked the vending machine company. They've never stocked it, they said, not in their machines, not in their inventory, not at any point in the hotel's history. But the can is real. I can hold it, shake it, feel the weight of the liquid still inside. I've never opened it. I'm afraid of what I might find. Soda from 1946 maybe, or something else entirely, or nothing at all, just an empty can that only pretends to be full, just like the alcove only pretended to be real. I still photograph conferences, still walk service corridors in hotels across the country, still work too hard and sleep too little, and push my body past its limits. And sometimes in the corners of my vision, I see alcoves that shouldn't be there. Spaces between rooms that don't exist on the floor plans, lit with light that's too warm, too golden, too much like sunset in a place that should only know fluorescent white. I don't investigate them anymore. I learned my lesson. But I wonder sometimes if they're investigating me, if every hotel corridor is a possibility, every late night a doorway, every moment at 2:46 a chance for time to fold in on itself and show me the spaces between spaces, the gaps in reality where things that aren't quite real and aren't quite unreal wait patiently for travelers who are too tired to know the difference. I wonder if I'll ever stop looking for them. I wonder if I'm supposed to. And I wonder most of all, if the figure in the corridor was showing me something that happened, or something that's still happening, or something that will always be happening at exactly 2:46, in an alcove that exists everywhere and nowhere, waiting for me to be tired enough, desperate enough, lost enough to find it again. My watch says it's 2:45. One more minute. I should probably stop looking at clocks. Story 10. Oh, the thermometer outside read -42 when the radio crackled to life at 3:17 a.m. I'd been alone at the Denali Seismic Research Station for 73 days. The isolation had become a companion of sorts, predictable, constant, suffocating in its reliability. Every morning I checked the sensors, logged the readings, transmitted the data via satellite uplink. Every evening I heated freeze-dried meals and watched the aurora paint the darkness with fingers of green light. The routine was a lifeline, each mundane task a tether to normalcy in a landscape that seemed to exist outside the rules of the world I'd left behind. The station itself sat on a plateau 12 miles from the nearest access road, reachable only by snowmobile or helicopter when weather permitted, which it rarely did. The main building was a prefabricated structure anchored to concrete pylons driven deep into the permafrost, designed to flex with the eternal freeze and thaw of the earth beneath. Inside, the walls were lined with insulation that made every sound feel muffled and close, as if the building itself were holding its breath. I wasn't supposed to be here alone. Dr. Richard Kern, my supervisor for the past 2 years, had been scheduled to rotate back to Anchorage in early November. But on November 7th, he'd taken the snowmobile out to check the remote sensor array 3 miles northeast. A storm rolled in faster than the forecast predicted, one of those white walls that turn day into a void of swirling nothingness. The GPS beacon on the snowmobile transmitted for 40 minutes before going dark. Search and rescue spent 11 days combing a 6-mile radius. They found tracks that led into a ravine, then nothing. The snowmobile, Kern's body, his equipment, all swallowed by the wilderness as if he'd simply stepped through a door into somewhere else. The station kept running. Data still needed collecting. I volunteered to stay on alone, telling myself it was dedication to the work. But sitting here now, listening to the HF radio hiss with static in the dead hours between midnight and dawn, I knew the truth. I'd stayed because leaving felt like abandoning him, like closing a door he might still walk through. The voice that came through the speaker made my coffee cup slip from my fingers. "Hey, it's me. I'm out here behind the station. Can you open the gate?" My throat constricted. The voice was unmistakable. Kern's slight New England accent, the particular way he softened his R's. I stared at the radio, its green frequency display glowing in the dimness of the communications room. The logical part of my brain cataloged impossibilities. No distress beacon, no emergency transmission, no explanation for how he could be outside after 3 months in sub-zero wilderness. "I know it's late," the voice continued, crackling with interference. "But I need to come inside. It's cold out here." My hand moved toward the transmit button, then stopped. Something felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The cadence was right, the inflection familiar, but there was a flatness underneath, like a recording played through damaged speakers. I stood and moved to the window overlooking the equipment yard. Floodlights mounted on the building's corners cast harsh pools of white across the snow. The chain-link fence surrounding the station formed a perfect perimeter, unbroken and empty. The gate stood closed, its padlock secure. Beyond the fence, darkness pressed against the light like something tangible. Nothing moved. "I can see the lights on," the radio said. "I know you're in there. Just open the gate." I grabbed my parka from the hook and pulled it on, my fingers clumsy with cold and something else. A tremor I told myself was excitement, or hope, or anything other than the dread that made my stomach clench. The inner door led to an airlock vestibule, then the outer door that opened onto a small platform with stairs descending to ground level. I paused with my hand on the outer door's handle, condensation from my breath forming frost on the metal. If it was really Kern out there, injured or hypothermic or desperate, every second mattered. If it wasn't, I pushed the thought away and opened the door. The cold hit like a physical force, burning my exposed skin and turning my breath to ice crystals that hung in the air. I descended the stairs carefully, each step crunching on frost-covered metal. The compound stretched before me, 60 yards of packed snow to the gate, flanked by the dark shapes of the generator shed, the equipment garage, and the fuel tanks. The wind should have been howling. It always howled at night, shrieking across the exposed plateau like a living thing. But tonight, the air hung perfectly still. That wasn't right. Even on the calmest nights, there was movement, some breath of air to stir the loose snow. This was different. The stillness felt deliberate, as if the world were holding itself in suspension, waiting. "Kern?" I called out. My voice sounded strange in the dead air, absorbed rather than echoing. No response. I walked forward, my boots squeaking on the packed snow. The floodlights threw my shadow ahead of me, a distorted giant that reached toward the fence. I scanned the darkness beyond the perimeter, looking for any shape, any movement. The fence was 8 feet high, topped with angled posts, not exactly high security, but enough to deter wildlife and mark the station's boundaries. The gate was in the center of the north fence line, a simple double-width affair with a chain and padlock. Empty. Completely empty. "I'm at the gate," I said to the silence. "Where are you?" Something touched my shoulder. The pressure was enormous, like a hand the size of a dinner plate pressing down with the weight of the entire Arctic behind it. The cold burned through my parka, through the thermal layers beneath straight into bone. I spun around, stumbling backward, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. Nothing there. Just the empty yard, the building's lights, the stairs I'd descended. But I could still feel it. Not a lingering sensation, but an active presence, as though invisible fingers still gripped my shoulder. I backed toward the fence, not wanting to turn away from the space where nothing visible stood. My spine hit the chain link with a rattle that sounded obscenely loud in the stillness. The metal was cold enough to burn even through my parka. "Just a few more steps," the radio crackled. But I'd left the radio inside. The voice was coming from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating in the dead air. "Come to the gate. Let me in." I looked at the gate. In the harsh floodlight, I could see the padlock clearly, the chain wrapped through the metal mesh. But something was different. The gate itself seemed farther away than it should be, as if the 60 yards of compound had stretched while I wasn't looking. Or closer. Distances felt wrong, perspective skewed in a way that made my inner ear scream warnings. Above me, a mechanical grinding cut through the silence. I looked up to see the HF antenna on the building's roof beginning to rotate. The motor wasn't running. I knew the sound of that motor, the steady hum that accompanied any manual adjustment. This movement was silent except for the grinding of frozen bearings, the antenna pivoting with arthritic slowness. It turned northeast, toward the ravine where the search teams had stopped looking. "That's right," the voice said, satisfied, coming from the air itself now. "You know where I am? You've always known." My hands shook as I fumbled with my flashlight, clicking it on and shining it toward the fence line. The beam cut through the darkness beyond the perimeter, illuminating snow dunes and the scraggly shapes of dwarf willows bent by years of wind. Nothing else. But the feeling of being watched crawled across my skin like frost spreading over glass. I understood then, with a clarity that felt like drowning, that opening that gate would be the last meaningful decision I'd ever make. Whatever was out there, whatever had taken Kern's voice and learned to use it, was patient. It had waited 3 months. It could wait longer, but it wanted in, needed in, and it had found the one voice that might make me unlock the door. "You left me out there," the voice said, and for the first time I heard something underneath the flatness. Not emotion exactly, but a vast cold hunger wearing emotion like a mask. "The storm took me down, and you gave up looking. Just open the gate, make it right." Guilt squeezed my chest. We had given up. The search teams had covered what they considered a reasonable search radius, and then the weather had closed in again and they'd left. I'd stayed, but I hadn't kept looking. I'd told myself it was impossible, that no one could survive in those conditions, that continuing to hope was just prolonging the inevitable grief. I'd locked myself in this building and followed my routines and pretended that was enough. My feet began moving toward the gate. I didn't decide to walk. My body simply started forward, drawn like iron to a magnet. 3 steps. 5. The padlock gleamed in the floodlight, waiting. The sensation on my shoulder increased, that impossible pressure spreading across my back, wrapping around my ribs. Not restraining, guiding, encouraging. The cold sank deeper, past muscle, past bone, seeping into somewhere that wasn't physical at all. 10 steps. The gate was closer now. I could see the individual links in the chain, the scratches on the padlock's face. My hand reached for my pocket where I kept the key. "That's good," the voice whispered. "Almost there. Just a little more." The antenna groaned again, rotating another few degrees. Northeast, always northeast, pointing at whatever waited in that ravine where the snow had swallowed Dr. Richard Kern 3 months ago. I stopped. My legs trembled with the effort, every instinct screaming at me to keep moving, to unlock the gate, to let in whatever wore my supervisor's voice like skin. But something else pushed through the fog in my mind, a memory of Kern himself, standing in this same compound last August, explaining the emergency protocols. "If something happens to me out there," he'd said, his face serious in the midnight sun, "don't come looking after dark. This place does things to your head when you're alone. You'll see things, hear things. The isolation makes you vulnerable. Promise me you'll wait for daylight." I'd laughed, thinking he was being overdramatic. But he'd grabbed my arm, his grip tight, his eyes intense. "I mean it. This place is old. Old in a way that has nothing to do with time. The indigenous people who lived here before us, they had rules. Never go out alone after dark. Never follow voices in the storm. And never, ever trust something that sounds exactly like someone you've lost. Promise me." I'd promised, still not entirely believing. But standing here now, with invisible weight pressing me toward the gate, and a voice that couldn't be real calling from the darkness, I understood. Kern had known. Maybe he'd heard the voices himself. Maybe that's why he'd gone out that day, into a storm that appeared with impossible speed. Maybe he'd heard someone calling him. The pressure on my shoulder became painful, insistent. The voice rose, shedding its pretense of humanity. "Open it. Let me in." I turned and ran. The weight clung to me, that impossible hand digging in, trying to stop my flight. I stumbled, caught myself, kept running. Behind me, I heard the gate rattle even though no wind blew, the chain shaking against metal with a sound like laughter. I hit the stairs at full speed, taking them 3 at a time, and slammed through the outer door into the vestibule. The inner door, the communications room. I was gasping, my lungs burning from the cold air I'd sucked in during the sprint. With shaking hands, I reached for the main breaker panel mounted on the wall. The generator was the station's heartbeat, a diesel-powered unit that ran 24 hours a day, keeping the cold at bay and the equipment alive. Shutting it down was a last resort, something done only for maintenance or emergencies. The cold would start seeping in within minutes. The temperature would plummet, but it would also kill every electrical system in the station, including the radio, including the lights. I hesitated, my hand on the breaker. In the darkness, I would be completely blind. Anything could happen in that darkness. But the voice was still coming through the radio speaker, no longer asking, now demanding in tones that made my teeth ache. Let me in, let me in, let me in. I threw the breaker. The generator's steady rumble died. The lights went out. The radio's hiss vanished. In the space of a heartbeat, the station plunged into absolute darkness and absolute silence. I stood frozen, my hand still on the breaker, my breath loud in my ears. The darkness was total, suffocating, a physical presence that pressed against my open eyes. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, couldn't see the familiar shapes of the room around me. The darkness was so complete it had texture, weight, presence. And in that darkness I heard it moving. Not footsteps, not breathing, but a displacement of air, a sense of something large and patient sliding through the room like water finding cracks. It had been outside, but now, no, it couldn't get in. The doors were locked, the walls were solid. It couldn't, unless it had never been outside at all. The thought paralyzed me. What if the voice had been coming from inside the whole time? What if opening the gate wouldn't have let something in, but let something out? What if I trapped myself in here with it? I pressed my back against the wall, trying to make myself small, trying to control my breathing. Every sound was amplified in the darkness. The creak of the building settling in the cold, the distant groan of contracting metal, my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. And underneath it all, that sense of movement, of something searching. Minutes passed, or hours. Time lost meaning in the absolute dark. My legs ached from standing rigid. My fingers cramped where they gripped the wall. But I didn't move. Couldn't move. Then, gradually, I became aware that the quality of the darkness was changing. The oppressive presence was fading, withdrawing like water draining from a basin. The air felt lighter. The temperature, while still dropping, no longer carried that bone-deep cold that had nothing to do with weather. Whatever had been in here with me, if anything had been in here with me, was gone. I counted to 100, then 100 again, before I fumbled my way to the emergency locker and found the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the familiar communications room exactly as I'd left it. Radio quiet, equipment dormant, nothing out of place. I restored power. The generator coughed back to life, the lights flickered on, and warmth began trickling back through the vents. Everything was normal. Everything was fine, except for the window. I walked over slowly, my flashlight beam preceding me. The glass was covered in frost on the inside, normal for the temperature differential. But scratched into the frost, as if traced by an enormous finger, were words. Found you. I stared at them until the building's returning heat made them weep and run, the letters dissolving into meaningless rivulets. Then I went to my quarters, locked the door, and sat on my bunk with all the lights on. The sun rose 3 hours later. I went outside in full daylight and checked the perimeter. The snow around the gate was undisturbed except for my own footprints leading to and from the building. No marks, no tracks, nothing to suggest anyone or anything had been there. I sent my scheduled data transmission, filed my daily report, and requested early rotation due to equipment concerns. They promised someone would be here in 5 days, weather permitting. That night, I kept all the lights on. The radio stayed off. At 3:17 a.m., I heard footsteps in the snow outside, circling the building with patient, measured steps, round and round, never stopping. I sat in the communications room with my back to the wall and watched the clock, counting each circuit. 42 times around before dawn. The same number of minutes the GPS beacon had transmitted before going dark. 3 days later, the replacement technician arrived by helicopter. He asked why I looked so tired, why all the lights were on, why I kept checking the windows. I told him I'd been working hard. He seemed to accept this. I flew back to Anchorage with a box of my personal effects and Dr. Richard Kern's research notes. I filed my resignation a week later. The official reason was stress and isolation effects. The real reason was that I'd started seeing the antenna on my apartment building rotating at night, always pointing northeast, towards something waiting in the dark. They found Kern's body the following spring when the thaw exposed the ravine. He was frozen in a half-sitting position, as if he'd been waiting for something. His satellite phone was in his hand. According to the logs, he'd made one last call at 3:17 a.m. on the night he disappeared. To the station. To me. But I'd been asleep. I never heard the phone ring. Never heard him calling for help. Asking me to come get him. To open the gate. To let him in. The coroner said he'd been dead for at least 48 hours before that call was placed. Equipment malfunction, they said. Phantom signal. A technical glitch in the phone's log. I didn't correct them. I didn't tell them about the message I found saved on the phone when they returned his personal effects to me. A voice memo, recorded at 3:16 a.m. that night. Just 2 minutes long. I've listened to it once. Only once. It's Kern's voice, weak and crackling, but unmistakably his. Don't answer, he says. Don't let it in. It found me in the storm. It's been learning how to sound human, how to want, how to need. It knows about the gate now. It knows about the station. I let it there. God help me, I let it there. Don't answer when it calls. Don't. Static. Then another voice, my voice, calling out in the darkness. Kern, where are you? And Kern, whispering now, terrified. It's wearing you too now. It's wearing both of us. Don't let it in. Don't. The recording ends. I deleted it. Threw the phone away. Moved to Phoenix, as far from winter as I could get. But sometimes in the dead hours of the night I hear footsteps outside my window. Patient, measured, counting circuits around my building. And I wonder if I ever really left that station at all. If maybe I opened the gate. If maybe I let something in that's been wearing me ever since, looking out through my eyes, learning what it means to be human from the inside. I wonder if I'm even writing this, or if it is. The only thing I know for certain is this. I never went back for Kern. I never opened that gate. Whatever was out there stayed out there. Unless it didn't. Unless it found another way in. Unless the voice I heard that night wasn't asking to be let into the station at all, but asking to be let into something else entirely. The antenna on my building is turning again. And this time, it's pointing at me.